Well, hello, friends. Hello. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you again. It has been so long. I hope that you are all doing well. Tonight, we are going to be discussing a very important topic, perhaps one of the most important that has been on this channel. How can we rewrite the Star Wars prequels? Can we fix them? Do they even need fixed? These are all questions that we are going to be addressing. And to help me do that, I have one of the best guests that could possibly answer these sorts of questions. He's been on the show before, and there really is only one way to introduce him.
Now, say my name.
Apostolic Majesty.
You're goddamn right.
Hello, Apostolic Majesty. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, hello, hello. And this evening I'm going to insidiously don the mantle of Darth AM. I hope that is satisfactory to you all.
Do I have to address you as Darth AM throughout?
Oh, obviously.
Okay. Yes, my master. And I
Yes,
thought
you're my young Sith apprentice for this conversation.
wonderful. And I thought some people who have come to the channel more recently may not have seen you on the channel before. And so I was thinking of how to introduce you beyond that clip. And the other day, people on Twitter or X, I guess it's called now, was summing up their personality with two fictional characters. And you shared these two, Apostolic Majesty. Sorry, Darth AM. Do you want to explain your character to us?
Well, yes, the image on the left is, of course, Hannibal Lecter, portrayed by Anthony Hopkins in the film Silence of the Lambs. Of course, I feel a uncanny similarity to Hannibal Lecter because I, too, in my, in the wee hours of the night, am drawn to painting images of Florence from memory. On occasion, I have been known to intimidate nubile FBI agents should they come over to my abode. And of course, I dine on human flesh regularly. So all of these things mean that the character appeals. As for this figure on the right, who is Fraser Crane, he appeals to me because I secretly long to live in that time warp of 1990s Seattle and go to Cafe Nervosa and just drink coffee and bicker with Niles ad nauseum ad infinitum.
That's quite an interesting blend, I must admit. You know, the eating of flesh, intimidating FBI, and talking a cafe ad nauseum. I do think it captures you somewhat, AM. My two characters. Let me see if I can bring them up. Where did I put them? Oh yes. So I'm gonna have to share this way. I went for Barliman Butterber from The Lord of the Rings because I feel I'm a somewhat jovial chap and welcoming. You can come into my stream, you can sit down with a pint, but also Chief Inspector, or is it Superintendent, Frank Butterby, who makes sure that his town is clean from all crime, injustice, and so on in the most vigorous way possible. I feel like he's maybe who I want to be, but I'm really Barliman Butterber. Maybe.
Well, maybe that's for the greater good.
Maybe. Bree would be a lot safer if we were all like Frank Butterby. That's all I have to say. There'd be no Bill Fernies. So on that well, maybe relevant though, we might get to these sorts of thoughts in relation to Star Wars. Darth AM approached me with this idea of rewriting the prequel trilogy, and this kind of begs the first question, which is, why should we? Why do they need to be rewritten? So what in your view means that this is a kind of plausible topic to do?
Well, I'm actually going to probably be less ambitious than rewriting. I really believe this is a process of redrafting.
Mm,
You and I are both about the same age. I believe you and I both grew up watching these films at a tender young age. So it's not just a matter of nostalgia, though. I was genuinely sort of enamored of these films when I was very young. Of course, growing up, I could see quite a few flaws. And of course, we now have the wonderful Disney Star Wars trilogy and all of the spin off television shows to compare this to. Um, what I find fascinating about the prequels is that they have so many ideas, so many. I mean, even when I
mm,
was 12 and watching Revenge of the Sith or 11 or whatever, um, I couldn't help but draw all these parallels to the rise of Nazi Germany, or the change of the guard from the Roman Senate to the Roman Empire, etc., etc. There are all of these little things, but consciously, whenever I look at the plot, it's all extrapolation. All of it is just extrapolation.
mm,
Always wanting to make a better film in my head, because there is a better film in there somewhere. It's just about taking all of these misplaced uh, puzzle pieces and rearranging them into a beautiful image. Whereas at the moment, it's just a incoherent mess. As they stand, I'm going to put this on record. The prequels are a total mess. And I'm talking about this primarily from a writing point of view. We can go into dialogue, we can go into acting, directing, all of these things. But I think that really is beyond the remit of our conversation. Maybe you and I can
mhm.
talk a little bit about aesthetics. I think you and I will probably agree that music is something that doesn't really need to be changed. The music of the films is pretty superb.
Yeah.
But yes, that's my particular interest in this topic. But I do believe that sticking very closely to the characters that are already in the films, the plot points, and you can say the thematic drivers of the three films, it is very possible to create a brilliant series of films. But George Lucas either didn't have the talent or simply didn't care enough to be able to flesh this out more, because I do believe it does exist.
See, I would agree with a lot of that, and I just want to kind of add to it because I do think there is some broader context to why this conversation is still relevant today. Because if you think about how many kind of blockbusters came out around that time, there's not many of them that people still talk about with passion. There's not many that people still refer to in memes. But the prequel trilogy does, and it's not just because we were growing up with it. It captured the imaginations of many of our generation, I think, and resonated in some way that maybe something like Gladiator, for example, or Pirates of the Caribbean didn't. I think then there is something deep within it which compels us to want it to be brilliant, and there's like a golden scene which we really love, and then there's the kind of casing which many of us have found issues with, and that's led to the whole kind of Mr. Plinkett deconstruction approach, where I think you've got somebody who genuinely, a lot of people who love Star Wars, who found in certain ways it didn't live up to how they feel about Star Wars, and so they want it to be, they want to make their own edition or change it in certain ways to make it up to that standard which the essence kind of has. So I think for me, that's part of it. Is that um, I love the prequels for that very reason. They're just they capture my imagination, and I want it to be wonderful. And I agree with you, AM, that there's as films or plots for films, they're a bit messy, and they can be tightened up to accentuate the wonderful things within them. And I hope that's something that we'll be able to do over the course of this stream. Um, with that in mind, it might be worth saying then a bit about the nature of these films, because they're not just, Lucas wasn't just trying to create another trilogy. He was trying to develop the prequels to the original story, and so that places certain demands upon the kind of story he can tell. And so it might be worth saying what are the kinds of things that he's trying to work towards in the prequel story? What is the end goal that he has to get to?
Well, I think there are three main plots going around the trilogy. The first one is the destruction of the Jedi. The second one is the destruction of the Republic. Both of these things correlate. One is the ascent of the Sith, and one is the creation of the Galactic Empire. And the third one is the decline and fall of Anakin Skywalker, which sets up the stage of the premise for the sixth film, where ultimately he could be redeemed by his son Luke. And so it is, in a sense, also an origin story of Luke and Leia as well, albeit there's very much an epilogue for the first three films. There are other things in there as well. There are other callbacks, other references, but to my mind, those are the three major plot lines.
I think that's right, and that is in part because these are all things which are at least hinted at or maybe said in a throwaway line here or there. So, like, before the Empire, there was a republic which lasted 1,000 years, and the Jedi were the peacekeepers of that republic. So,
1,000 generations, Nathan.
1,000
Never
generations.
forget.
Sorry.
1,000 generations, even though Lucas seemed to forget.
Yes, yes. See, just as a forewarning to everybody in the chat, I'm going to definitely butcher some of the lore here. So just getting started straight away is a good thing, I think, on that front. But yeah, so you've got that line there. So we know already that the prequels have to deal with that and how that transition took place. As you mentioned, you've got to get to a point, or you've got to leave the story in such a way that A New Hope can take place in the way that it does.
And of course, within A New Hope itself, it begins with essentially the assembly of those officers under Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin, basically stating that the Senate is no longer an issue. The Death Star has become the supreme power in the universe. So you can say that the creation of an empire is actually formalized at the beginning of A New Hope. And it begins with Revenge of the Sith, built upon the precedent of the Clone Wars, etc. So it is, if anything, a continuing story.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that's right. And then, as you mentioned before, Anakin's journey from being the apprentice of Obi-Wan Kenobi to becoming Darth Vader, it has to deal with that as well. And I agree. Those are the kind of three main story beats that it has to reach. Do you feel that there's, like, any one of those would be a massive project? Do you feel that there's a possible tension trying to integrate all three of those into the prequel trilogy so equally? Because I feel like Lucas tries to give them all as much depth as possible, but that means that they're competing a lot of the time.
Well, the funny thing is, I think if Lucas actually dealt with these themes more. I mean, to me, the problem isn't that these themes are competing for space. The problem is there's just so much nonsense, which is instead filling up screen time, which doesn't actually pertain to any of these things. I don't really want to get into the minutiae of the plot yet, but you can just omit certain characters, certain plot lines altogether, reassemble them, and nothing of any sort of value will be lost. And just for the record, I know everyone's going to point to Jar Jar Binks or whatever. I'm completely ambivalent towards Jar Jar Binks. I don't care one way or the other. I was just thinking actually before going on the stream that if Lucas was in any way self-aware as a writer, Jar Jar Binks could have made fun of the fact that all of the Jedi written in that film was so bland and so lacking in any personality. Then you have this crazy character who is just essentially a mentally sort of stunted alien who is poking fun at these completely sort of emotionless and personality-less Jedi. But of course, that doesn't come across because there isn't that hint of self-awareness in those films. But just little things like that, you know, I'm looking at things that advance the plot. And as I can go through when we go through bit by bit, plot line by plot line, there is so much you can remove and focus on these main three themes, because I believe that they aren't competing for one another. I believe they're they all share a common thread, and strengthening one of these things actually strengthens the other two. It's not simply a matter of focusing on one to the detriment of the other, because of course the fall of the Jedi is reflected both in terms of the physical loss of the temple and the displacement of Yoda and Obi-Wan, the murder of everyone from the younglings, but it's also shown in the fall of Anakin Skywalker as well. And of course the fall of the Jedi represents a destruction of a power competitor to Palpatine for his rise to become Galactic Emperor, in the same way that Anakin is needed to be a tool to create that empire. So all of these things intermesh. And that's why I need to emphasize again why I'm so fascinated by the prequels, because I fancy myself as someone with a tinsy-wincy bit of creativity, that I can look at this and I can see a fantastic set of films before me, but unfortunately it's just inundated with all this nonsense and everything sort of wrongly positioned, that instead when actually confronted with the films and I have to turn my brain off, it's just infuriating. But there we are.
Maybe a kind of further point on this, the kind of general nature of it as well. The original trilogy, to my mind, and feel free to push back on this, they're primarily adventure stories. They don't really deal with politics too much. And it's really about a bunch of heroes and they're thrown into situations. It's good for evil and so on. Obviously a lot more complex, but I think that's, in general, they're more like Indiana Jones.
No,
In some way.
I actually fundamentally agree with you.
Okay.
You can say the prequels from a Lucas standpoint, given Lucas's rather sort of basic appreciation of history. The tale of why the Nazis came into power is, if anything, more interesting than how do we defeat the Nazis, which is effectively the next three films,
Hmm.
if we're going to make it that simplified. But yes, it is essentially an adventure story, and it's a hero's journey told for Luke, and him being able to overcome the Empire and all the friends he makes along the way in order to help him achieve this. So yes, I would actually agree. And this actually makes the prequels even more fascinating, is that even though they fall many times at various hurdles that are put up, the story that can be told in the prequels is, if anything, far more interesting than that of the sequels. Whether they would make better films is a matter of debate, but
Mm.
purely in terms of the expansiveness of the plot and the world building, I think the prequels actually has the advantage from the premise alone.
Well, you see, I would agree with you in terms of a story. It's more compelling, the prequels. But I wonder if part of the, you've been mentioning nonsense a lot. Is part of the problem that Lucas is trying to tell this tragedy, but he also wants it to be an adventure like the originals, and so he's blending these two things together, and the genre clash doesn't serve the story.
I mean, this is the weird thing. When I was going through, and I will get into them shortly, my
Yes.
redraft for the prequels, I was actually trying to consciously make it appear as close to the sequel trilogy as possible, not for the
Okay.
purpose of plagiarizing, but just to make it thematically and stylistically consistent. Because you're right, there are elements of the wacky adventure, like Jar Jar Binks and what's his name, Jake Lloyd, off to get into the pod race and have that bet with Watto and all these ridiculous things, mired in this story about a planetary invasion and galactic corruption, all of these sort of things. And when it comes to the prequels, these things don't mesh. I don't believe it's because they are diametrically opposed. It's because Lucas is incompetent and he can't see a way of melding these various things into something which is compelling and coherent. Instead, it's almost as if you're seeing two films
Mm.
being told at the same time, and it's incredibly jarring, especially in the first film.
I think that's fair, and a lot of people have commented on that. The kind of tone shifts between scenes, maybe reflecting this as being something which is quite. Um, it kind of makes you suddenly aware that you're watching a movie rather than being fully immersed in the story. But with that, then why don't we get into your drafts? And maybe the first place to begin, rather than the minutia, is the broad arc. Uh, what's staying the same? What's changing in this broad redraft of the 3 films?
Well, of course. I mean, hopefully, it's not just going to be me speaking. It's going to be a collaborative effort.
Oh yes,
But
yes.
I do see it being possible that the first film can basically stay almost exactly the same when it comes to broad strokes, i.e., Naboo is invaded, the Jedi go back to Coruscant, the Jedi come back and they defeat a Sith, and Padme and Anakin, meet each other, all those sort of things. Anakin is rescued and he becomes initiated into the Jedi Order. I believe all of these things can be achieved because I'm trying again to stick to what Lucas was originally trying to achieve. I mean, in terms of me going back to this really obvious, I mean, as a historian, it does sort of grate on me when I do see these very obvious parallels. But in terms of, oh, this is the coming of World War II, the National Socialists are coming to power. What obvious parallel can you see with the Phantom Menace?
Go ahead.
All right, it's the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The Nemoidians are just the Japanese. Naboo is Manchuria. Even Princess Amidala is dressed like a Manchurian princess, down to the headgear. It's quite uncanny. You go back to the League of Nations, which of course is the Galactic Senate. They say we're going to send a committee to investigate the claims of Manchurian self-determination, and ultimately they don't do anything. That's basically the plot of the film. And I think it's very obvious that Lucas he basically just saw that and tried to make that into a film, but didn't quite know how to make it work in terms of making it into a compelling narrative. But it's possible to keep that core idea. And my first idea, um, if you've watched The Phantom Menace, which I assume you have if you're watching this stream, the beginning is very confusing because you have a blockade being set up around the planet of Naboo. There is this organization led by this weird alien race called the Nemoidians who have droid armies. And Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn have come over there to settle a dispute over the taxation of trade routes, if I can remember properly. And something happens. There are a couple of sort of hologram messages that they receive. We're introduced to a shadowy Sith figure who is collaborating with them. He tells them to execute the Jedi, and that basically sets the events in motion. Now, this to me is a complete failure in terms of an introduction because we have really no idea what the stakes are in this, and we barely have an introduction to any of these characters. And to me, the way to start this off is to create definite motivations for everyone involved, whilst keeping essentially all of the actors that Lucas has set up. One of the other things I thought about is actually removing Darth Maul and replacing him with Darth Plagueis at the beginning, making Darth Plagueis the primary antagonist of the first film, in the same way that Count Dooku should have been the consistent antagonist of the second film, and indeed part of the third film as well. Because Darth Plagueis can be there, and he can be that representative, that link with the Nemoidians and attacking Naboo, and he can have a far more sort of domineering and you can say evil presence in those films. And really my sort of rewrite of this would be that Palpatine isn't referenced at all in terms of his stakes in this. Um, he really is the Phantom Menace. You don't see Ian McDiarmid dressed up in a hood talking to these aliens on a hologram, which makes it pretty obvious. I mean, obviously, if you're going to look at the star lineup and you're going to see Ian McDiarmid's name, you know he's Palpatine. You know he's going to end up as the Emperor. But it shouldn't be so obvious from the film perspective that you see Ian McDiarmid playing the Emperor Palpatine in one of the first scenes in the film. Otherwise, it's not really the Phantom Menace, other than the fact that he's wearing that stupid hood. So, in terms of setting up a clear goal for this, and someone is saying, Imperial Crusader 21 is saying, I wasn't confused by the beginning of the Phantom Menace. Okay, Imperial Crusader 21. What was the dispute over the taxation of trade routes? Why did the Trade Federation blockade Naboo? What was the dispute? None of this is ever told or explained. And we're also never explained what Darth Sidious's connection is to the Nemoidians and what their treaty was, essentially. Is that fair to say?
I think that is a fair point. That it's what you said. It's a dispute over trade, but the exact nature of that dispute is never really that clear beyond that phrase.
Or even
So,
what the Trade Federation is, or how the economy works,
mhm.
or really any of these things. I
Well, for
mean,
example, to me, the biggest question mark I had over that scene is why does he tell them to kill the Jedi? It just seems totally out of the blue suddenly. Oh
yes,
yeah,
and
just go and kill some Jedi who are here to, on behalf of the Republic to achieve a diplomatic solution. That's going to aggravate the situation. Now, maybe that's part of his plan, but
it doesn't make any sense.
it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
So in order to make this very obvious, I thought, okay, well, first things first. This is also something that made my mind just boggle when it comes to the second film. The Queens of Naboo have terms of office as it transpires in the second film. And when I saw that scene in the Clone Wars, I was just completely baffled. Why on earth would the people of Naboo elect a child as their queen? And when she ceases being child, her term has, ended, whatever. Okay, so that's complete nonsense. Let's throw that out. The beginning of the film is Amidala becoming queen of Naboo, and she becomes queen due to the unexpected death of her father. It's hinted at, but is never confirmed, that her father may have been the target of assassination. He may have been assassinated by the Sith. He may have been assassinated by the Amoidians. He may have been assassinated by a corrupt Naboo official. We don't know, but it's enough to create serious uncertainty on Naboo, and it's enough to essentially cause a huge amount of civil strife at the ascent of a very young queen. The Jedi are not introduced in the film to settle the trade dispute. They're there to essentially represent the Republic at the ascension of this new young queen. Naboo, of course, as in the plot, has no army. It simply has a local militia that can barely defend itself. Also, it's a very rich planet, which is obviously shown in the film. It's a rich planet, yet it has no defense. So its relationship to the Republic is key, essentially, and the Jedi coming there is basically like a vote of confidence in the struggling new queen who's completely out of her depth. Immediately, from a character perspective, I hope this comes across, Nathan, that actually creates a character for Padme, a bit of an arc, whereby this is a poor girl who's had this immense responsibility foisted on her. She doesn't know what she's doing. Whereas if you actually watch The Phantom Menace, it really does seem that George Lucas had intended her to basically emulate Queen Elizabeth II in that sort of monotonal, non-charismatic delivery. Do you think I'm completely wrong there? That's definitely the impression I got.
Yeah, because that's the archetype of monarchy in the 20th century.
Exactly. And to my
Yeah.
mind, she shouldn't be the archetype at all. She should be struggling incredibly with what it essentially means to have this position at such a crucial time, and fitting in with this whole prospect of an assassination narrative. This would be the precedent for the Nemoidians, along with the Sith, to invade Naboo and make it clearer. It's nothing to do with a dispute over trade routes. In my sort of redraft of this, the Nemoidians are basically a militant up and coming power. They have several star systems already under their command, or several planets at least. However, they don't have all the resources they need in order to create an army of their own in order to basically stand up against the Republic. So Naboo is a defenseless planet which is also very rich and has some resources that the Nemoidians desperately need to be able to build up their droid army. Say, for example, it could be anything like that. It doesn't matter specifically what it is, but that's a very obvious motivation, isn't it, for the Nemoidians wanting to attack them. However, the Nemoidians on their own are worried that the Republic and the Jedi are going to come after them should they decide to just seize control of Naboo and try and test how strong the Republic is, especially when the Jedi are there. So in comes Darth Pelagius. I'm not sure how much you know about the Star Wars extended universe, and again, just out of reference, I'm not basing this knowledge on any additional reading material coming from the films. I haven't read any of that additional reading material. I'm just going off other sources of Star Wars media where I'm familiar with. But you could say that Darth Pelagius is coming around from Korriban, which I'm not sure if you know, Nathan, is like a typical Sith planet, or he could be from the Outer Rim or anything. But Darth Plagueis has decided that now is the time. The Sith are sufficiently powerful enough where they can make their presence known in the galaxy, and they're going to join with the Neimoidians in order to announce their presence. So, in attacking Naboo alongside the Neimoidians are getting their hands on this coveted resource, but Pelagius is wanting to commit a dramatic atrocity against the people of Naboo and against the Jedi in order for the Jedi to come to Naboo unprepared, trap them, and then Darth Pelagius can kill them all. In that sense, you can say that the original plot point you referenced earlier about why does Sidious want to kill the Jedi, actually here it makes sense. So in terms of the setup, I think this is a very clear, high-stakes setup which can carry the rest of the trilogy.
I think that definitely adds a lot of what you said about the motivations, the desires, and where the conflict's going to go. One question I would have is that, well, in kind of versions that I've been playing around with, thinking for this stream, I was almost tempted to actually make Maul the primary director of the attack on Naboo, with the Neimoidians under him, because one of the things about the Phantom Menace is, though he is the primary antagonist for the Jedi within that film, he's got very little character development, very little in the background of who he is or what he's up to. He doesn't feel like he's got any depth as a villain. But if you've got this individual who's already directing affairs, who's then going to end up being the one that they have combat with later, that gives him higher. He has a higher importance in the story, and we're already engaging with him as a character. So I wonder what you would think about making Maul the go-between, as it were.
Well,
Rather than
Maul was my first thought. But I'm not worried about using Pelagius because he's directly referenced in the third film. So if he's referenced within the films, he therefore exists as a character, and he exists as Darth Sidious's master in the series. I don't believe Darth Maul, the character is written, really adds much to the story. But when taking Maul, taking him out, taking the Sidious scenes out, and making it all Darth Pelagius, in my rewrite, Darth Pelagius is the one who fights them at the end of the film, not Darth Maul.
okay, right.
This plays into the whole idea of the Phantom Menace. Darth Sidious is not the principal actor of this film, but he benefits greatly from it. You can almost say that there are two different Sith plots going on at the same time. One is the careful, diplomatic, covert policy of Palpatine, and one is the through military fiat, I'm going to come along and I'm going to bring war against the Jedi. And there is, you can say, a fundamental conflict of philosophies. Yet also, if we're looking into the Sith and the rule of two, Palpatine also wants Plagueis out of the way. So, funnily enough, he's actually in helping get himself elected Chancellor and sending the Jedi off to attack Pelagius. He is actually responsible for a power struggle within the Sith, and in killing Pelagius, he comes out as the Sith master on top of this. So I think it's almost like a double Phantom Menace. He's assuming power, the first step on the ladder to be able to become emperor. Yet he's also eliminating his old Sith opponent. I think that to me is very interesting in terms of fleshing out both Pelagius as a character and fleshing out Darth Sidious as well, making him the apprentice in this situation, more so than Darth Maul.
Yeah, I can see that argument. I think there's strength in that. Yeah, and certainly having a Pelagius as the villain in that way, he's a real villain, which I think is something the first and the second film really struggle with, is that their villains are not strong.
Well, yes, Palpatine is the only strong villain, really at all. And even if Count Dooku were to be fleshed out, he wouldn't be a Sith. He would basically be a fallen Jedi. He would be a conflicted villain. I hate to bring the sequel trilogy, but I would hope almost that Count Dooku were a far better written version of Kylo Ren, as it were. I hate to bring it in because Kylo Ren is a ridiculous character, and people are sort of attracted to the idea, oh, he flip-flops, he doesn't know what side he's on. No, his character is just inconsistent. That's all it is. But I think Count Dooku could be the perfect archetypal fallen Jedi if he were fleshed out. But Pelagius here is the sort of brute Sith warlord, in contrast to the Machiavellian machinations and subtlety of someone like a Palpatine. So in that way, you can say that the three enemies both represent very distinct, and contrasting characters, which would make the series more interesting, hopefully.
Well, just while we're on Dooku, because I do have a suggestion for that, and I know it's in the future of this series, but the what strikes me is obviously he is Qui-Gon's old master, and Qui-Gon. Well, I assume, I don't know for sure, but in your redraft that Qui-Gon still dies at the end of the Phantom Menace, while fighting a Sith, and it always struck me that it would have been much stronger if you had Dooku in the Phantom Menace imploring the Jedi to go with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan back to Naboo to fight this Sith. They ignore, and then Qui-Gon dies, and you have a real motivation for revenge, both against the Sith or those who killed Qui-Gon, but also against the Jedi and the Republic from Dooku, which would give him a real drive and almost a foreshadowing of maybe some of Anakin's characteristics as well.
It's fascinating, really, you bring that up, because you've almost completely read my mind, because I think that's a perfect way of bringing fleshing out the character of Dooku. I mean, it's ridiculous to me that Dooku does not exist in the first film, where him being on the Jedi Council, even his presence alone, would have been enough to basically confirm the shock that a Jedi Master has defected. But because he has no presence at all, it just compounds the issue that he's a really underdeveloped character. But because this is a dramatic story of the fall of the Jedi, something that should really be apparent is the contrasting philosophies among the Jedi themselves. And Dooku could encapsulate that, as indeed could Obi-Wan. I believe that Obi-Wan should be the undisputed protagonist of the first film. And he should also, I mean, you can say that, okay, he's just become a Jedi Knight. His mission to Naboo is the first big mission he's ever been assigned on. Qui-Gon Jinn is basically the voice of the council, so to speak. He's there thinking about the diplomatic repercussions of going in head first and trying to fight this or fight that. And he's trying to restrain the impulsiveness of someone like an Obi-Wan. But ironically, Obi-Wan is actually more of a reflection of Count Dooku and that impulsive personality to want to go ahead and actually use the Jedi to be an active force for good in the galaxy. Have you ever played Knights of the Old Republic 2?
I haven't, no.
Well, it came out around the same time that Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith came out. And it basically does a very good job, much better than the sequel trilogy, of deconstructing Jedi and the Sith. Not just in terms of saying, say, for example, oh, the Jedi were all good, and then, they were destroyed by the evil machinations of Palpatine. No. One of the main philosophical points there is the consequence of action versus inaction. There is a war going on one side of the galaxy, and the Jedi Order split. One group, led by a Jedi Master called Revan, go off and they essentially battle the Mandalorians. I mean, surely you've heard of the Mandalorians. And in the process, they fall to the dark side because they have given over to bloodlust, they have given over to the cry of battle, and they have become consumed by their emotions. And yet, had they not done anything, the passive Jedi Council that basically sat behind and did nothing and critiqued these Jedis from the Council, had they done nothing, the Mandalorians would have simply conquered the galaxy. So it opens up an interesting conversation as to what is the role of the Jedi Order. And I think this should be represented within the Jedi themselves. Are we knights in the sense of being crusaders, or are we monks in the sense that we are simply existing to commune with the Force? And that means absolving ourselves from any sort of lay duties, any sort of compulsion to act with compassion and defend the defenseless, all these sort of very obvious Christian, and coming up with George Lucas again, samurai themes as well, all of these weird influences that come together, Zen Buddhism, etc., to form what the Jedi are. And of course the monk warrior contrast exists within Japan as well. So all of these things really could be fleshed out in the trilogy if we're going to take that as a first principle, to flesh out all of these characters and explain why the Jedi were destroyed because of this schism within the Jedi. And ultimately this could explain why Anakin fell. But instead, if this idea is present in the films, it's delivered in a terrible way.
But it's delivered in a terrible way, but there is the parallel, I guess, of the, and it is there in the Phantom Menace, of the ineptitude, the corruption of the bureaucratic liberal democracy, let's say, in contrast to the strong, decisive, great man, the person whose authority resides in themselves to establish.
But see, to me, going back to our big three themes about the destruction of the Republic, that's a political argument. This is more of a religious and philosophical point pertaining to the Jedi themselves. If we're going to look at the film, Mace Windu says, "Oh, we will discover who your attacker was," and says, "Oh, just go off and see who he is." There's no sort of big argument. Are we going to go off and face Darth Maul? They just inexplicably only send the two Jedi. And I think, therefore, the films miss so many opportunities to really flesh out the strengths and also the crippling weaknesses of the Jedi. And this, I think, can be explained through Anakin's peculiar sort of upbringing. So I think moving on from Naboo, I think having established that as a first premise, I think things can proceed as they do in the film. The point now is to get the Jedi off to Coruscant to warn the Senate as to what's happened, because they were there representing. And I think it means more if they were there with the Queen saying, we will defend you. They offered to bring her back and smuggle her out. But I think one of the big flaws in the film is that she comes with them. I believe it would have created so much investment in the plot had Amidala stayed on Naboo and said, "No, I am the queen of these people. I'm not going to abandon them. Even if I'm going to be captured and I'm going to suffer, I'm going to suffer with my people." So in that way, there are real stakes established, because as the film is currently construed, we don't really see any Naboo citizens. We don't really see any strife. And also, I think for Anakin, this could be the first major motivation he has to actually want to save someone, when he's told by Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan that there is a young queen who has basically been captured by the Nemoidians and the Sith, and we're going to help rescue her and liberate her planet. I think that's a far more compelling narrative than have her go over to Coruscant and issue the vote of no confidence against Chancellor Valorum.
I think you're right, and it gives that sense also of there's a race against time, that they need to get back as quickly as possible to rescue the princess. So yeah, I think that's a good call. And I understand what you're saying about Anakin, and there is parallels, of course, with Luke seeing Leia in the hologram. I do wonder if Anakin would need a similar image of her. To see her for some kind of
maybe. I mean, to
motivation.
me, the only reason this is important, obviously this doesn't happen in the main trilogy, but the reason this is important is that it basically creates something, some spark, some glimmer of where their relationship is going to go from that original sort of insinuation that she's in trouble. Because as it stands, the only relationship they have is Natalie Portman smiling at Jake Lloyd at the celebrations at the end of the first film. First of all, I also think just get rid of Jake Lloyd. I don't think that's going to be controversial at all. Make Anakin 15 or 16. Don't make him 10. Make him a character who is already mentally mature enough to have a sense of who he is. But I think also Lucas was very, very adamant on this. Lucas wanted a character who was essentially innocent. And that is almost betrayed in the fact that Tatooine is so odd in terms of all the events that are going on there, and the fact that he is a slave, yet he's also
Yes.
happy and cheerful and mispronouncing Coruscant and all these sort of things, and inexplicably building C-3PO and all these things, even though he was a protocol droid.
Yeah, can we scrap that?
Get rid of all these things.
Yeah.
And I know this is because I'm not pretending that this should be anything very complicated. This is very simple. And the very simple thing to do to create a basis for Anakin's character and his tragedy is to give him a tragic background. I mean, that's a very cheap trick that writers use, but it's also a very effective one. Instead of basically just saying he's a slave, but he's just tied to this random junk dealer who just so happens to have these two Jedi ask for a particular part to heal their ship or whatever, make it a bit more dramatic and interesting. I mean, if you rewatch that entire part of the film, it seems to be the most convoluted way possible to arrive at a pod race.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even figure out a way of making it more stupid and convoluted if you try. But I think just make it so much more simple. The Jedi have escaped. Their ship is shot down by, let's say, a Sith trooper to make it more intimidating, rather than what exists in the film. There is a bit of damage after they evade the blockade. I mean,
That's right, yeah.
it's so boring compared to something dramatic like they're being hunted by the Sith. I mean, maybe even Darth Maul has a bit of a cameo here. Just basically, I mean, if you're going to bring in like a Indiana Jones comparison, I mean, he could basically be the muscle, and Darth Plagueis in this situation can be the brains of the whole operation. But whatever it is, the plot continues on as is. They land in Tatooine. The ship is basically destroyed, and the Jedi go off without Queen Amidala, and they try and find a new ship or a way of fixing the ship. But of course, as is already set up, Tatooine is completely in shambles. There is no law. It is basically an explanation of why the Republic failed, which again should play into Anakin's whole sort of outlook. So they go into this like big city on Tatooine, in my sort of rewrite of this, and there is this epic pod race that kind of looks like the Hippodrome in Constantinople, and this is actually a nexus for crime and money for the Hutts, because of course they make so much money on gambling and they put so much money invested in their particular pod races. And Anakin is one of these pod racers, and that's how you see him entering. And as a 16-year-old racing in this and making tons of money for his Hutt benefactors. Except, of course, he is a slave. He's had a horrific upbringing, and the only sort of human connection he has is to Shmi, who doesn't live in a comfortable little house doing nothing, and who is also a slave. But she's, a hard sort of manual worker. She's had an incredibly tough life as well. Yes, someone's mentioning pod racing would be like a mafia operation, effectively. Yes, I'm sort of imagining that too. Because all of these sort of things just make the character, all of a sudden, there is no contrivance. It's very obvious. These Jedi have arrived and they see a person in a terrible situation. And in terms of why would Anakin be introduced to them? Well, my sort of way of contriving this would be, they're saying, oh, we can't get a chip, we have no money. And one of the people relating to the Hutts says, oh, well, we have this master mechanic, who is he? And they point out to Anakin on the pod racer. And it's very clear, everyone thinks, oh, the ship can't be rebuilt, whatever, the ship can't be rebuilt. And yet so it happens. Anakin is able to fix the ship. And obviously the Jedi come to the conclusion that he is an incredibly talented Force user. I think that is a better premise for getting him out of that situation and bringing him on board with the Jedi, rather than the Jake Lloyd situation. But just as a basic setup, what do you think of that?
I really like that introduction of Anakin, because it's not through dialogue, it's through seeing him on the screen. It ties in very well with what's said in the original trilogy. He was a great pilot and so on. So you're already getting that inkling that he's going to be something special. And it's far less contrived, because it's the natural place that the Jedi are going to go to try and resolve the issue of getting back to Coruscant. And Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think what I'm interested to hear though is, well, from leading on from that, is how you think they can get him out of his slavery. Like, how does that change? Because obviously that's part of Lucas builds that into the pod race. If he wins, he can go free, and they get the ship as well. So,
In
like,
that
he
incredibly
is a nice little
complicated
bow,
bed.
you know.
Yes.
But it seems to me then you have to come up with something else
Yes, I
for
mean, I
this
mean,
draft.
imagine in this situation, Watto has a cameo, but that's all he's going to have, I think, in this. The typical sort of Middle Eastern junk dealer out on Tatooine. Tatooine, by the way, is also a city in Libya, just in case you're curious. But in terms of my sort of thinking, the Hutts realize that these are Jedi. They realize that they have major clout back in the Republic. So maybe a thought I had is that the Hutts allow Anakin to fix their ship on condition that essentially they go back and promise them certain favors, and the Hutts believe that they will, oblige them because they are Jedi. They are known for their honesty, their integrity, and their diplomatic prowess, so they won't betray them. However, afterwards, it's very obvious that Anakin is in a horrific situation. He desperately wants to leave. He realizes that this is going to be the rest of his life. He's just going to be nothing more than a pawn for these people. And Obi-Wan, clearly conscious of the fact that he's a Force user, has basically said, well, maybe there's a better life awaiting for you. And also, more so than for himself, because I think this is a very important way of developing Anakin's character, he wants to get his mother out of slavery. Crucially, he wants to get her off the planet as well. And based on this, Obi-Wan, going past sort of Qui-Gon, goes and tries to co-opt the Hutts and saying, well, can we also get these two people freed, and we'll come back and we'll give you whatever we want or whatever. And in that situation, they say, well, no, Anakin is making us far too much money. He's already fixed your ship. We don't need anything more from you. And this could actually cause a bit of a character clash. Qui-Gon is insistent that we leave them behind. We go because we can't risk a war with the Hutts. And it is Obi-Wan, in a split-second decision, is the one to basically curry Anakin off as a stowaway on the ship and cause him to escape. But in that situation, I think Shmi is separated from Anakin, and she's left behind, and he doesn't know what fate awaits her. But as a result of that, there's a huge conflict between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan over him defying his orders and him creating a diplomatic incident with the Hutts, him basically violating his word. But Anakin is now their responsibility, and they have to find a way of resolving this issue.
I think there's that is a good way to resolve it. I think that would also introduce the tension between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and show the character differences that you've kind of been building up through this draft. The thing that I would push back against, or not push back against, but I found quite difficult with Anakin, and I don't know if the films really get to grips with it either, is that I just don't believe this version of Anakin would leave without his mother, because he so wants her to be free
Oh
with
no, I
him.
agree. And this situation, the one I've contrived, is that it's only happenstance that she doesn't come.
Right.
Essentially, you can almost say that they're rushing towards the ship or something, and the Hutts are there. They've got guns trained on the ship, so if they don't go, you can contrive a situation
Mhm.
where if they don't leave, there's a countdown. If they don't leave, then the Hutts will destroy the ship. They can either leave with Anakin or they can't leave at all. Anakin obviously desperately wants to bring his mum. But no, my sort of thinking here is that there isn't a conscious decision by Anakin to leave her
Yeah.
behind. It's very much Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan saying, well, we've got no choice. We have to leave her behind or we're all going to be captured or destroyed.
So then I think the knock on to me is that um, it's it would be difficult then to frame Anakin as being greatly motivated to then be concerned about the welfare of the Queen of Naboo. And I just say that because I think he'll just be thinking, "How do I get back to free my mother uh, at the next available opportunity?" So I do wonder if then cuts that avenue off later in the film.
Well, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about
Mm.
regarding the second film. I mean, I'll just come up with it in terms of how I think this should be resolved in the second film, because in the second film, the real film, Attack of the Clones, um, Shmi is raped and killed by Sand people, and Anakin goes on a
Mhm.
murderous rampage, and then inexplicably, Padme forgives him. My thinking would be that Anakin. There are lots of things you can actually play into this. My thinking is that Anakin comes back in the same way, and I'll try and explain how that happens. He finds his old Hutt slave master, who basically, sold her off and basically gave her a death sentence through working in a mine or whatever. And Anakin desperately wants to murder this person, not just for what he's done to his mother, but for what he's done to Anakin himself. And it's Padme is the one who is able to prevent him from murdering
Mm.
this person. And in that sense, you can almost say that Padme is his deliverance. He is preventing him from prematurely falling to the Sith, and she is able to save him in a sense from falling just to pure hatred and anger in the way that we see Anakin develop. And she is able to provide that strength and support and bring him to the light, so to speak. So I think the relationship between Padme and him losing his mother is sort of essential in terms of sort of construing this. But as in the short term, I think this actually plays a lot to the strengths of the Jedi in terms of as a plot device. So the Jedi have taken Anakin
Mhm.
sort of unwillingly now because his mother's left behind, back to Coruscant, and they're basically telling him, we can't go back. We've basically declared war on Tatooine by stealing you. And when he arrives back on Coruscant, it could almost be that the more hardline Jedi, the more sort of pacifistic monk-like Jedi, is saying, "You have an exceptionally powerful Force user here." Oh, and it should also be said right off. I don't believe in all this virgin birth thing with Shmi. All the aspect that he was
Okay.
created through the divine essence of the Force, which was contrived through Pelagius and Palpatine. No, he's just an exceptionally powerful Force user, and let's leave it at that, because that's enough to establish his character and his fall. You shouldn't have to contrive this, because it makes Palpatine seem omniscient and always in control of events, and I do believe that also undermines the character, because it makes him seem too powerful, too intelligent, too complex, too far-sighted, in a way that all the other characters have to be idiots in order to ensure that everything works just how. I mean, that's also something that should come across in the three prequel films, is that Palpatine is the only character who is allowed full agency. All the
Mm.
other characters in some way have to be denied agency in order for Palpatine's plans to come to fruition. And I think taking away something like the virgin conception just limits Palpatine in such a way and makes Anakin more realistic just as a powerful Force user. But anyway,
Well, just on that before you proceed, I think as well, it gives the Force a kind of agency, because the Force, and we could tie this in with maybe something like Thomas Carlyle's conception of the laws of nature. It gives rise to certain individuals at certain times to do certain deeds, to bring forth justice for Carlyle. So I think there's this sense that actually maybe there's something beyond just the characters we see, and the Force itself having some kind of agency over reality beyond what the Jedi or the Sith are aware of. And so it brings forth this individual, which it doesn't matter what their kind of origin story is in some ways, is who will play this significant role, even though he's on this backwater planet that nobody would ever think would be the
I'm
place of
really,
that.
I'm really wanting you to look into KOTOR 2 now, because that's essentially the plot.
Or is it?
The main antagonist, Kreia, her central plot is the Force has a will, and I'm going to destroy the Force. I'm going to use the Force, but I'm going to overcome the Force and become truly human.
Ah.
So no, all of these sort of aspects are present, and they're only sort of hinted at.
Mm.
I also think the whole destiny thing, you were destined to destroy the Sith. Um, Maybe that should be hinted of more sort of circumspectly, as opposed to just being invented out of nowhere in the second film. But anyway, coming to this point, when we arrive in Coruscant, we already have the division within factions, and it's already represented in the division between Qui-Gon, Dooku, and Obi-Wan. But regardless, Dooku is on the council. To my mind, I mean, you already have so many characters. That's one of the weird perks
Yeah.
of looking at the prequels. You can just take one of these characters and repurpose them. So let's take what's his name, Ki-Adi-Mundi, for some reason. Let's make him the chief of the conservative Jedi. Obviously, Yoda can't fulfill that role because Yoda is too beloved. Yoda is almost, you can say, a mediator between the two extreme factions. I think that's a good place to put him. But let's take Ki-Adi-Mundi and let's make him the head of the conservative Jedi. The conservative Jedi are terrified that Anakin has been brought to them, because here you have a very powerful Force user who is untrained, and basically, if he were he can't be let out of the Jedi sight now because he may cause grave danger, great calamity, and the Jedi need to train him, not in order to make him combat ready, but in order to allow him to undergo a process of self-denial, to destroy his inner volition, to destroy his will, to destroy all these feelings of attachment, in order that he basically become passive and he doesn't go out and he doesn't cause havoc. And this, to me, is a brilliant way of compounding the issues with his character. He has this tragic backstory. He comes in and all of a sudden he's been taken off, he's found an escape, and really he's become imprisoned again by the Jedi, who are saying, no, yes, you have great power, but this is a threat to all of us, so we need to find a way of forcing you to contain this power. And moreover, we need to force you to forget or deny everything that you possibly fear of losing, like your mother. So we need to divorce you from these emotional detachments. And this isn't anything, this isn't stretching anything. This already exists within the dialogue of the Phantom Menace. All you need to do is to make it clearly more insidious and dark than it really is, because this can really open up a debate within the Jedi. What do we do? We're basically severing this poor Jedi's link, or would-be Jedi's link, with his mother, but we have no other choice, because if he were to be let loose, he could very easily join the Sith. And the Sith have just announced their presence in the world with Darth Plagueis. So I think that in itself creates all the foundation of a very strong character moving forward throughout the trilogy.
And I guess at the same time, you would have your Dooku character pushing back, saying, actually, we should be training this individual so that they can harness their great power for, greater good within the universe and so on.
Yes, exactly. But the universal response of the council is that he needs to be trained, whether it's to repress himself or whether it's as a sword against the Sith. He needs to be trained. He cannot be allowed to return to his mother at this time. The Jedi need to capture him in a sense. And this is why I think the whole Padme situation actually works in a way, because Padme is something he's allowed to resolve. He's allowed to go off and he's allowed to retrieve Padme, is allowed to rescue Padme, even though he's not allowed to rescue his mother. And later in the second film, he will use Padme as an indirect means of trying to get to his mother again. When he's, I have thought about this, but again, I think this should be a testament to the fact that there is so much there in the prequel trilogy that if Lucas just had a tiny bit more forethought regarding these characters and these concepts, fleshing out what is already there, it can actually make for an incredibly compelling story. And moving on from there, as with the film, this is why I really consider this to be a redraft and not a rewrite. Things can just continue on as before. Valorum basically represents the inaction. I mean, I almost feel like changing his name. He shouldn't be called Valorum, because Valorum obviously means valor,
Yes.
honor and facing death. No, he should just be some sort of a corrupt stand-in. And this, if anything, should make Palpatine seem more virtuous by comparison, as that Palpatine is right. Valorum is useless. Valorum, the Jedi have committed themselves to protecting Naboo. Naboo's entire society is predicated on their relationship with the Republic. The Sith and the Neimoidians have attacked it in the most obvious way to weaken the Republic. And by his inaction, the Valorum, or whatever name we're going to ascribe to him, is basically saying the Republic is dead by not intervening on this issue and allowing Naboo to fall. Because if Naboo falls, then no planet within the Republic is safe. So Palpatine, of course, being the senator of Naboo, is perfectly positioned, again, using the actual dialogue that exists in the film with the sympathy vote. He can go in and he can lead the cause for taking Naboo back from the Nemoidians and the Sith. However, the problem is there is no army. And this is going to be an issue which comes back in the second film. So the only thing he can do in the short term is rely on the Jedi. But of course, the Jedi are not just there willingly going to fight off and become a political faction for the new Chancellor. So, as you mentioned with Dooku, this creates a split within the Jedi. The Jedi go over, and you can take. I think it's fair to take figures like Dooku and take figures like Mace Windu, and make them form their own little faction. They go off in defiance of the council. Yoda attempts, to bring peace between these two factions, and they fail. So these are the ones, ironically, the Sith Lord is puppeteering these Jedi to go off and go into the jaws of Pelagius's trap to kill all the Jedi, which is established at the beginning. And this is where you get all the things in the original film. You get an epic fight with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn against, and maybe some other Jedi fighting some droids or whatever against Darth Plagueis. And again, with Anakin, you can say that maybe Obi-Wan takes Anakin with him again against the volition of someone like a Qui-Gon, because he really, say, for example, wants to help. He doesn't want to stay with these people he doesn't know. He wants to join them on a mission. He has no attachment to the Jedi. He basically feels a prisoner there. So Obi-Wan, again, in sympathy. And if anything, this can really beef up Obi-Wan's character, because then Obi-Wan has so much culpability in terms of making Anakin into the sort of Jedi that he is.
That's true, yeah.
So the more that Obi-Wan becomes responsible for Anakin's rise and basically responsible for Anakin's decisions, then Obi-Wan has more of the blame. But also it makes it, going back to Alec Guinness's portrayal of Obi-Wan in A New Hope, if we're going to look at this as a real friendship and see him looking back at someone fondly, then there has to be all these little character moments where they are helping each other along in order to build that sort of relationship. Because as it stands currently in the three films, it's basically, he's jealous of me. He's jealous of my power. He's all of these sort of ridiculous things. And I think you can't establish that sort of animosity. And I think one of the great weaknesses of the Phantom Menace as it stands is that Qui-Gon is made the sympathetic stand-in and not Obi-Wan. If Obi-Wan had been the sympathetic stand-in, then their relationship becomes healthy. It becomes understandable. And if anything, it makes it more tragic when Obi-Wan and Anakin will obviously fight at the end of Revenge of the Sith if their friendship is established, as opposed to in the Phantom Menace when it's really obvious that Obi-Wan really doesn't like Anakin, has no interest in training him, and only does so out of obligation to Qui-Gon's memory. All of these things are really weird decisions, and all you have to do is emphasize Obi-Wan's role and culpability for Anakin's ascent in the Order vis-a-vis Qui-Gon.
I think that's a lot easier given Anakin in this version's a teenager, 16 or so. So he's going to be closer to Obi-Wan in age. I guess Obi-Wan's like early 20s.
Yeah,
so they're more likely to be friends. Yeah, whereas if he's a 10-year-old, the Qui-Gon thing works because he's a kind of father figure to him. But that's not what this needs to be. So I think that's a very good way to work it. I would I actually think though that so when the Jedi kind of have this division over it, I think it would be good still for Dooku and them not to go with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, because I think that then gives Dooku real motivation in the next film for turning against the Jedi so strongly after the death of...
I think that's probably a good decision, and probably it's because, let's say Qui-Gon isn't a member of the Council, whereas Dooku is a member of the Council. Let's say Mace at the moment is still not a member of the Council. Let's say he's just a Jedi Knight. So let's assume that it's basically unheard of that a member of the Council basically defy the Council and goes off and creates a schism. So all of these younger Jedi, these more virile Jedi going off to fight, but Count Dooku, his sort of turn and joining this other faction would be unprecedented. He's desperate to go off and fight. He's desperate to protect his apprentice, Qui-Gon. Yet at the same time, he will be essentially permanently splitting the Jedi Order by doing so. So yes, I think that's a good call as well, and thereby strengthens his character, because then he feels not only vindictiveness against the Jedi, but he feels personally responsible for not being there when Qui-Gon was
Yes.
killed.
Yes, I think that's the way to really draw that in. So in terms of the ending, then you've kind of mentioned that some of the Jedi will be there. The two main Jedi are fighting Darth Pelagius. What's Anakin doing in this? Is he destroying droid battleships?
Well, to my mind, Pelagius is in the palace, and he's
Hmm.
basically standing in between the Jedi and Padme. And Anakin, that's Anakin's sort of motivation, is to be alongside Obi-Wan, and it's to join him in rescuing Padme. As for the Nemoidians, I mean, in the film, as it so happens, there's a very complicated ending whereby Anakin goes off and inexplicably is able to fly a Naboo fighter and destroy a blockade command ship, which causes all of the droids, all of these sort of things. And that in turn invalidates everyone else's actions. So
Hmm.
I mean, you can still have the Gungans. I know this is sort of silly, but in terms of, I mean, you can still have the Gungans. You can still have the ordinary citizens of Naboo. You can still
Hmm.
have the fact that maybe there's an established rivalry between them. Maybe the Naboo look down upon the Gungans as some sort of, inferior, water-dwelling species or whatever. And maybe it's all of these sort of things you can, cheap things you can
Hmm.
bring in, these conflicts and resolutions. I mean, it's very easy once you sort of understand the tricks of this sort of thing. You could even have, like I said, I'm ambivalent towards Jar Jar. You can have him in the film, you can have Boss Nass in the film, you can have all of these characters. And the fight against the Nemoidians is really the fight of Naboo. So it's the ordinary sort of militia of Naboo, and it's the Gungans who are the ones taking the fight to the Nemoidians, while the Jedi are taking the fight to Pelagius. So essentially two fights happening at the same time, but it's not convoluted in the sense that you have capturing the Viceroy or,
Hmm.
attacking the control ship. It's basically just one battle in which the Viceroy is captured by the Gungans and and the forces of Naboo, and Pelagius is killed, but in the process, Qui-Gon is also killed. And I think maybe to emphasize Pelagius's power, there are more Jedi with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and he is able to kill a couple more Jedi, almost in that scene with Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith when they go and attempt to arrest him. Because again, we're talking about the great dark Lord of the Sith who has returned from Korriban. If he were defeated by two sort of relatively junior Jedi, I mean, it
Yeah.
makes sense that Maul would be defeated, because Maul is basically the covert apprentice of Sidious, but not Darth Pelagius. And if anything, that also makes him more intimidating as a character. But I think if we're going to sort of end uh, the film there, it can end in the same way, where we talk about confirming Anakin's training.
Hmm.
And if anything, I think in terms of all the decisions that have been made regarding Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan's culpability, essentially the council put it on Obi-Wan that their fate is essentially tied, that you are now responsible for making sure that Obi-Wan does not fall. And the council will basically look over your shoulder all the time, will be reviewing your decisions regarding bringing up Anakin, because you are in some way responsible also for letting Qui-Gon die at the same time, maybe through some sort of contrived logic. I don't know. But I think establishing a clear sort of link whereby the council has been forced into a situation where Anakin needs to be trained and Obi-Wan is given that responsibility, well then, and we've already established this is simply a confirmation of what has already been agreed to before. But I think
Yeah.
leaving that as the end of the film, and again, seeing Anakin, a 15-year-old Natalie Portman and a 16-year-old Hayden Christensen or whatever meet up, would establish a more sort of clear direction for where their relationship is going down the line. But as I think I've illustrated with this, it's very possible to keep the basic structure of the Phantom
Yes.
Menace and make it somewhat more compelling, I hope. um, it's really not that difficult. If anything, makes this more frustrating.
Well, I think you've done that, and I want to just suggest maybe an alternate ending, slightly different. I think it still follows a lot of those beats, um, but I almost feel like because I feel almost that a character like Darth Pelagius is too powerful for somebody like Obi-Wan to kill in this context. And that's always kind of annoyed me a little bit about the Darth Maul one as well. Like he's able to kill Qui-Gon Jinn, and yet Obi-Wan can kill him. There's this kind of strange aspect to it. And so I almost wonder if you have to get into a situation where Qui-Gon realizes the other Jedi are no match. They're all going to get wiped out if they all fight Darth Pelagius. So he almost has to lock himself in with Pelagius or put them both in a situation where there's going to be a self-destruct or something like that. And he's locked in with him. He's stopping him from escaping this fate, thereby saving Obi-Wan, Padme, and Anakin so that they can get away, but also sacrificing himself.
No, I agree. These are sort of particular things. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
focusing, as you know, on the more broad strokes. But I agree with you completely that Qui-Gon's death. I mean, like I said, you increase the stakes by having more Jedi, a higher
Mhm.
sort of Jedi, body count. Pelagius wants this. He wants Jedi dead. He wants all the fighting Jedi dead, so the Jedi will be useless against the advance of the Sith. But he has underestimated Qui-Gon and Qui-Gon's willingness to be able to defeat him. So yes, contriving a situation where Qui-Gon willingly gives his life to destroy Darth Pelagius through some sort of contrived means, like setting off a bomb or something, where the others can
Mhm.
escape, I think underlines that. And also, yes, it emphasizes Darth Plagueis' character and underlines Qui-Gon's sacrifice. And if anything, Qui-Gon needs that to finish the
Yes.
film, because Qui-Gon has been a very restrained character throughout this entire story. Qui-Gon has been the one saying, no, we shouldn't take Anakin away. No, we shouldn't just run headlong into a war zone and create conflicts with all these planets. So just to underline your
Mhm.
point, it would really add to his character if he is the one who ultimately makes the most reckless and selfless decision at the end and chooses to destroy himself in order to save Obi-Wan. So I think that's a very good plot device.
I agree, and you were literally reading my mind when you said that because it gives him that he's finally released himself to the Force rather than to the Jedi code, let's say. So I think that would be a perfect way to end the film. And then, so now we're on to the second film, Attack of the Clones. So we've got that set up. How are we starting this film?
I think maybe for a bit of variety, I've been the one to sort of suggest the beginning of Phantom Menace. So how about you suggest the beginning of the new Attack of the Clones?
Oh, okay, okay. Well, we'll see what points of agreement we had. But part of my initial outline would have been for Maul to survive the Phantom Menace, but we can leave that aside because he and it could be him still actually, but him and a number of um, soldiers, warriors, one including Jango Fett, who in this version is not necessarily a bounty hunter. They launch an attack not just upon Padme, but upon the Senate. And it's this kind of dramatic terrorist attack, essentially, killing many of them. And this causes a great crisis within the Republic, as you would imagine. And it leads to questions about the Jedi and their ability to protect the Republic. It raises the stakes for the need of an army or calls for an army. The sense of inactivity and passivity of the Senate and the Jedi, allowing for voices such as Count Dooku's or his kind of philosophy to rise more strongly, and then leads as a kind of instigating moment allows for two things. One, that um, several Jedi, including Obi-Wan, are sent out across the galaxy to hunt down those who perpetrated this attack and find out who's behind it, because it's not clear who's behind the attack at the beginning. But the second thing is several Jedi are assigned to be bodyguards to various senators given what's just happened, and as a way of reassuring them that the Jedi have things under control. And this allows for Anakin, who's maybe too junior to be sent out on one of these solo missions, to be assigned to Padme. And so then you have the setup of the two, Obi-Wan and Anakin, having to split, but with a much more dramatic instigating event, which isn't so focused on Padme, because I always found that was a little bit, it felt a bit contrived in that respect, whereas this would, to me, feels a bit more natural why the characters are moving in the ways they are.
It's interesting how you and I seem to have so much synergy when it comes to these sort of things, because I was thinking that we replace the assassination of the decoy with a more dramatic and general attack on Coruscant. I mean, I again, I'm ambivalent towards Jango Fett as a character. He may or may not be needed in that film. I don't really think there's any necessity of having him. But also, one other point I want to make re Padme's character: get rid of the whole decoy nonsense. The whole decoy nonsense that exists in the first film. I mean, what does it honestly add? The fact that the character who goes off and talks to R2D2 and goes off on Tatooine is not, in fact, the Queen. I mean, it's just, it adds absolutely nothing to the whole plot. And we've already solved that issue by having her stay in Naboo, so we don't have this character who is the Queen and also Padme at the same time. So just get rid of all that decoy nonsense and come back to this idea. I think the one thing I might add before to lighten this story a little bit, because obviously in my draft, it begins with, a possible assassination, and it begins with a dramatic invasion. My sort of a revision to this slightly would be, yes, this event happens, this dramatic attack on Coruscant happens, but at the beginning of the film, there's kind of like an Indiana Jones-esque introduction where we have a unrelated adventure whereby Anakin and Obi-Wan are doing something out in the galaxy. They're helping something, they're retrieving some precious artifact or anything, just to have their characters established. They come back and then they see that there has been this massive attack on Coruscant. Of course, we see that attack, but they only return after the attack, so they're not the ones in Coruscant defending against it. They're having this wacky adventure somewhere else in the galaxy. I think that's
we should actually see them with the Gundarks. I think that would be the perfect story.
I mean, you can have any number of Star Wars references. I mean, one of the reasons I don't like Jango Fett's introduction is that I just think of it as like, oh, remember Boba Fett? Remember Boba Fett? I mean, these little things sort of infuriate me, the way that Boba Fett is integral to the whole Clone Wars. But ignoring that, essentially, I agree with your point. It's just a way of sort of building character between Obi-Wan and Anakin, because I think it's pretty obvious that they consistently reference things within the films, things they've done, but you're never shown anything. And this isn't a novel point. This is something that Mr. Plinkett makes consistently in his reviews as well. The fact that they're always having to tell, not show, when it should be the other way around. But I think having them back and having them realize the devastation of Coruscant should, underline their motivations to want to deal with it. They've been away resolving some other issue, and while they're away, the capital and the Jedi Temple itself has been attacked, and Padme is in mortal danger. This actually comes back in terms of building upon this, and the idea that one party goes off to search for the culprits, and another goes off to protect the senators. This is actually, to me, building a bit of Padme's agency into their relationship, because their relationship in Attack of the Clones is inexplicable, really. Inexplicable from both sides. That there's really no reason that, other than physical attraction, that these two characters should have a relationship. And for some reason, Padme is the one who has her shields up, even though Anakin is the one being trained to be celibate. So all of these things are sort of ridiculous. And I think we already have, with this new draft, the fact that, Obi-Wan and Anakin are closer to the same age and more like brothers. The fact that Anakin and Padme are closer to the same age also helps in this situation. But Padme is very acutely aware of the fact that since the attack on Naboo, there is an over-reliance on the Republic in order to come and save them. Yet at the same time, there is this gulf brewing between Palpatine, the senator, who is now the Chancellor, and herself, who she has remained queen. This whole thing of her becoming senator, just ignore that. She remains queen. It's much more simple and satisfying that way. As queen, she basically wants to retain Naboo's independence. She doesn't want to see the creation of the army, because she basically sees the militia of Naboo being conscripted to join a Republican army to go off and fight wars.
Yeah.
And she wants to retain Naboo's independence. So weirdly, this is the beginning of a conflict. You can almost say that they can also talk about Palpatine. They can talk about their experiences, Anakin and Padme can say, well, Palpatine was my father's senator. I had very little to do with him. And, almost immediately after I ascended, he became Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. So he and I have completely differing philosophies. Because again, trying to stay true to the spirit of the original films, which is weird to say, but I am sincerely trying to be as consistent in the characters. The consistent thing the character Padme has, because she barely has a character, but this is one thing she does have going for her. She is against the creation of the military. But there's no reason.
True, yeah.
But there's no reason she's against the creation of a military, because if anything, her character should be the most pro-creation of the military, because she has had her planet be attacked, and it's her senator, it's her chancellor who's going off proposing this strategy, and ultimately it will be her surrogate senator Jar Jar Binks is the one to propose the law. So all of these.
Oh no, he dies in the attack, by the way. Just to be clear.
Like I said, I don't mind if Jar Jar stays, he becomes a senator, or Jar Jar goes and becomes a Dark Lord of the Sith. All of these things can occur if people want them to. Like I said, I'm completely ambivalent. But as far as I'm concerned, there has to be a reason why she is anti-war, and this is the best reason I can find as to why she's anti-war. She wants Naboo to remain independent, and that would only make sense if she was the queen and not simply the senator. So this actually plays into her role with Anakin, because she sees Anakin. She has a good relationship to Anakin. To be quite honest, she's attracted to Anakin. Yet at the same time, she needs a protector. She needs someone to basically tell the other planets, we are not to be messed with. We have a Jedi on our midst. So not only does she want someone to offer her a basically temporary protection, but she wants someone who can basically be kind of like the Constable General of Naboo, someone who can stay there and someone who can act as a deterrent against future attacks. So there is a hard political motivation for her to want Anakin to come over, which doesn't really exist in the films. And I think that actually gives the character a little bit of agency. And it means there's actually some political logic as to why those two characters might get involved. It's not just this inexplicable, physically motivated romance. And so in this situation, Padme is the one who's trying to tear Anakin away from the council, tear him away from the Jedi, and trying to claim him. You can almost say that another theme with Anakin's character, to really flesh him out, is that Anakin has always just been a pawn in this story. First, he was a pawn to the Hutts, then he was a pawn to the Jedi, now he's a pawn to Padme, and later these two contending forces will be competing with Sidious, with Palpatine, over the influence of Anakin as well. It's simply a matter of what relationship is the healthiest, and ultimately his relationship with Padme, we would assume, is the healthiest out of all of these ones. Slavery, imposed celibacy, or servitude to the Dark Lord of the universe. Hopefully, a happy relationship is the healthiest out of all of these situations.
I don't know. That last one is quite tempting, but I think. I think as well, from Anakin's point of view, the attraction to Padme would be she herself feels somewhat trapped by the Republic and is trying to seek the independence of herself and her people. And he resonates with that because that's what he wants for himself.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes.
He's
So I think
looking
you built a really good foundation there.
Yes, but that's like how relationships work. It's sort of remarkable looking at this because, you know,
Hmm.
it wasn't actually too much thought to think, okay, why would Padme be interested? Well, okay, this is a justification. And all of a sudden you have a practical and you have an
Mm.
emotional core to a relationship which doesn't have a practical or emotional core at all in the films. But also him becoming detached from the council means that he now has freedom for the first time since he's arrived on Coruscant. And he's also away from Obi-Wan, which means essentially he is his own master as a Jedi. And he takes this time to go and find his mother. Basically, Padme gives him the opportunity to go over to Tatooine and find out what happened to his mother. And I've already brought this factor in before. He finds out what happened to his mother. He confronts his former slave master. Padme is the one to stop him murdering his slave master out of pure anger. So in many ways, she actually saves him from breaking his Jedi training and falling to the Sith, but he falls away from the Jedi anyway because he's now devoted to her more so than being devoted to the Jedi. So you can say that this represents he's been saved, yet he's also fallen as a Jedi. He's broken that training and he's now fallen in love with Padme. And to me, that's very clear. It's very obvious. And also, if you add in for Padme the issue regarding her father's assassination, this is now a woman who's had no strong male role model in her life, and now she's looking someone almost again like a surrogate to fill that position in Naboo. So psychologically, all of these things now exist to create the bedrock for that relationship. So, I mean, really, what more can be said about it? I think in terms of creating a genuine story, I think this is also a way, like I said, of bringing out competing views. Anakin's essentially, you can see this as a way of fleshing out Anakin's backstory. Anakin, during his reminiscences with Padme, can talk about his experiences on Naboo. Maybe he can reveal some more aspects of his life as being a slave, and maybe Padme can also reveal more aspects of her character. Because as it currently stands in the films, we have very little character development for either of them, and very little backstory.
Yeah.
Padme especially, and so this whole setup would provide a perfect opportunity to buttress that sort of relationship. And I think in the end, the way to sort of split paradise is to have someone like a Count Dooku dramatically abduct them rather than them going off to find Obi-Wan. I think if we're going to establish a protectorship situation, they should actually be attacked as opposed to going off to fight danger. And I think this is where we come back to Obi-Wan, because we've avoided his part of the story. And these, of course, are happening in tandem. But when it comes to Obi-Wan, you and I agree that Obi-Wan should be going off and looking for Count Dooku after we've established some relationship at the beginning with this Indiana Jones-esque story at the beginning with Anakin and Obi-Wan. I think this also is a good opportunity to find out that, okay, Count Dooku has left the Order and no one knows where Count Dooku is. And maybe Obi-Wan, basically everyone says, oh, you know, Count Dooku has basically gone off to search for some, you know, Force temple somewhere. He's gone off to seek some sort of hermitage somewhere. He's basically become an anchorite. He could never have joined the Sith, because to the Jedi, in their obstinate arrogance, there is no way that a Jedi master on the council could have fallen and become their enemy. Unlike in the film, where Padme basically just says, oh, Count Dooku's behind it.
Yes.
There should be no insinuation whatsoever that Count Dooku was behind it. It's simply a matter of Count Dooku was established in Phantom Menace, and now Count Dooku has disappeared, having already expressed, you know, a huge amount of irascibility in the first film regarding again, we don't really see the effects of Qui-Gon, but they are felt in the second film. And maybe it's Obi-Wan who is the one who takes deliberate interest in the fate of Count Dooku. The others are basically going up dead ends. They're barking up the wrong trees. But Obi-Wan is the one saying, okay, well, I'm going to actually look to what's happened to Count Dooku, because no one else seems to care. And through the journey of Obi-Wan talks to, again, other characters who have already been introduced in the actual film. So take, for example, Joe Castanu, who is the librarian at the Jedi Temple, or so someone like Plo Koon, another council member, characters who have nothing fleshed out about them at all, but can actually become characters because they know Count Dooku. And maybe Obi-Wan, because he's been so away from Count Dooku, he barely knows Count Dooku. He only knows Count Dooku superficially because of Qui-Gon, and now Qui-Gon is dead. So now you can almost say, because Qui-Gon's dead, he's that much more interested in the figure of Count Dooku, because he's the only remaining link he has to Qui-Gon. So the tale of Count Dooku and the tale of his dissatisfaction is being told, recreated through these various characters that Obi-Wan is talking to. And one of them lets slip where they believe Count Dooku's last sort of known location was. And he goes there. And this, to me, is the big twist in the film, which fundamentally alters everything that the prequel trilogy established. The clones should not have been made for the Republic. That, to me, is a very obvious point. We set up a very effective droids being used by the Nemoidians. You can say, battle droids, and the weaker droids are basically like garrison units. We want to make the Nemoidians actually look as intimidating as possible, but nevertheless, the Nemoidians are infuriated because their droids had not been able to withstand an attack from the Gungans and the Boo militia. So instead, they are the ones, along with other separatist systems, to have commissioned the creation of a clone army. Now, why is this significant? It will be very consistent with the Nemoidians and their whole military ethos that they want to get other units to do their fighting for them. They don't have Nemoidian conscripts out there fighting, and clones are simply basically the next step up in terms of escalating droid warfare. And now you have synthetic humanoid warfare replacing that. And the reason why I thought this was such a stupid decision in the whole plot of the prequels is that because the clone troopers are all interchangeable and they're not really people, then all of a sudden there is far less emotional attachment to the Republican troops. There's almost no attachment to the enemy or the goodies, supposedly. And as we know, they're both being controlled by Sidious. None of it really matters in a way. And of course, this isn't explained in the subsequent trilogy, in the main trilogy. In the main trilogy, they're all just humans. Yet, yes, we know in sort of more developed material that there is an animus between humans and aliens, and the Empire is responsible for that. But there is no reason to assume that clones were the ones fighting on the Empire side. There is only one reference, which is in A New Hope, when Luke asks Obi-Wan whether he fought in the Clone Wars. So there's no reason why the clones had to fight on the Republic side. So as far as I'm concerned, the shocking revelation shouldn't be this incredibly convoluted situation where someone commissioned 10 years ago a clone army out of nowhere and no one inquired as to where it came from, but that specifically the Nemoidians, with the ascent of Count Dooku, commissioned the creation of a clone army. And it is this link that actually confirms in Obi-Wan's mind that Count Dooku has defected to the Separatists, not necessarily fallen to the dark side, but he's basically joined a cabal of shady figures who are wanting revenge on the Republic for their defeat in the first film. To me, that's a far more sort of dramatic and also straightforward revelation as opposed to the revelation in Attack of the Clones. What do you think of that?
I think there's so much that's good there, and I was playing around with this myself because, as you say, in the original films, it does not expand on what the Clone Wars are, so there's a lot of scope for changing sides and who the clones serve. I think that it would be a great twist and something that would be quite a shock, and also heighten the threat to the Republic, which is the very thing which is at stake.
Exactly.
With the
I mean, it
the
seems like
initiating
it seems like
event
an
of the
absolute
attack.
it seems like an absolute contradiction, isn't it? That you don't create a grand army of the Republic after an army has been created for you. Rather, you create an army in response to an enemy army being created.
Yeah.
That to me seems an incredibly logical point, but for some reason it's something that George Lucas missed. And again, with the pod race, the whole Camino situation seems incredibly convoluted, and ultimately it was to the disservice of the entire trilogy.
Yes. The only thing that I would suggest maybe changing is removing the Neimoidians from this, because I can't see Dooku allying himself with the people who he would partially blame for the death of Qui-Gon. If this is a huge part of his motivation, then I think he would want revenge on all these people. And
Yes, but
his cabal
to be
bring.
fair, I think my differences between Dooku is that I think this is less to do with revenge. I think this is, I want to reform the Jedi. I don't want to destroy
Mm,
them. I want to reform the Republic. And I believe that the Separatists offer a better hope for a better future outside of the Jedi Council. Because if he were just doing this on revenge, I mean, he would be
mhm,
worse than Pelagius in many ways. And you can also say in this alternative story that what's his name, Viceroy Newt Gunray, was
mhm,
captured and he was dethroned, he was deposed, and instead there is a new Neimoidian ruler who basically acquiesces to Count Dooku's demands or whatever. But Count Dooku is the figure with sufficient gravitas and clout within the Republic to be able to unite all these forces together. And it's not clear what the link between Sidious and Count Dooku is, but
mhm,
I don't think this should be explicitly stated in the film. Maybe it's only hinted at, but I think maybe it is. I don't know. Uh, Again, it's kind of like in the films when how does Count Dooku become the apprentice ultimately of Sidious? It's barely ever explained, and I almost think that the only way of resolving this is if Count Dooku only meets an aspect of Sidious who is fully immersed in his evil power, because one of the great facets of what do I mean by that? One of the great facets of Palpatine is the fact he's able to completely shed any obvious influences of
mm,
the Force. He's able to present someone who has no Force abilities whatsoever, and definitely is not completely sort of mired in the dark side like he is. So maybe it is a case that Sidious is following the developments of Dooku, actively goes out and seeks him out and tries to teach him in the ways of the dark side, and basically offers that form of apprenticeship, but not as Palpatine, as the figure of Sidious. And he does so by basically assuming a different form, a different face. And maybe it could be the situation that Count Dooku only later comes to realize that he's fighting against Palpatine, who is the same figure, Sidious and Palpatine, because there is a lot regarding their motivation. And my big twist in the third film is that it is Count Dooku who lets slip what Palpatine's ultimate personality is.
mm,
I'll wait and explain that later. But I think it doesn't make any sense that Dooku would honestly want to go and consolidate the Separatists if he's also working unconditionally for Palpatine.
right, yeah,
So the only way that I can see this working is if Palpatine basically mentors him as a different person in going down the dark side of the Force and basically using him. But he can only do so by assuming a different persona, if that makes sense. To me, that's the only way this can work, because Count Dooku's entire motivation and his relationship with Sidious is kind of like when he gets assassinated at the beginning of the third film. He doesn't
yeah,
just say, wait, Anakin, this is the evil Dark Lord of the Sith.
mhm, yeah,
So there has to be some reason as to why Count Dooku is prepared to basically be the fall guy for the other side. And the only way I can justify that is that Count Dooku really believes that he is an autonomous reforming agent of the Separatists, and not simply that he's the puppet of Palpatine. So there should be, if there is that scene at the end of Attack of the Clones where they're going off and saying, good news, my lord, the war has begun, then definitely in the mold of Sidious, there should be no implication that Sidious is Palpatine. And again, I don't know how else to contrive it, because it really is a fraught plot point to bring up in terms of what their relationship is. But the only other alternative is that Count Dooku learns the ways of the dark side on his own, and I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer anyhow. How basically they're two Sith lords appearing out of nowhere and don't seem to have any connection with one another. I do believe there needs to be a connection, but I believe
mm.
that Count Dooku needs to be duped in some way in order to make it work. He is unwittingly the pawn of Palpatine, not willingly.
I think I mean I completely agree with a lot of what you've said there, because I think part of it is Dooku's motivation, I would see it as a mixture of revenge and reform, and that the formation of a clone army is about, we want to conquer the Republic so that we can reform it, we can establish justice, we can bring corruption to an end. And given the attack, given the events of the first film, this is going to resonate with a lot of the systems. Many of their representatives have just been killed. So there's a real appeal to it, and many of the planets might join the separatist cause. I think you're right, though. If that's going to be the key motivation for Dooku, he can't be serving Chancellor Palpatine under that guise. So it will have to be in some other way, some other guise that Palpatine is approaching him and training him. Maybe it isn't even a question of explicitly joining the dark side, but more, you want to do these things. You want to save, the Jedi, the Republic. You need to embrace these emotions, take and anger and so on. So I think you can definitely draw that out of Dooku. And then when he confronts Obi-Wan, there's a real choice there for him, given that they're both trying to respond to the death of Qui-Gon, and how to pursue justice in that context, how
and
to
it,
be
and it's
true
much and
Jedis
it's
in that.
much clearer. It's much
Yes.
clearer that Dooku would have a much more compelling offer to Obi-Wan had it not been the case that Dooku was willingly and knowingly a Sith. Rather,
Mhm.
he's affiliated with a version of Palpatine who happens to be Sidious, but he's not adopted the ways of the Sith. He's not a Sith apprentice of Palpatine. He is merely basically seeking counsel and advice, ways of augmenting his power, because of course now he's set himself apart from the rest of the Jedi, and he's concerned
Mhm.
with how to defend himself. And now he's set apart. Essentially, Palpatine is offering him a way of assuming more power, and that is his primary concern. But there has to be a split within his character, and to me, this makes the character of Dooku more interesting when the fundamental turn in his character comes when he realizes that Sidious and Palpatine are the same person, and that ends up being the next bit. But I'll save that for now. So regarding Obi-Wan's capture, because I think we should agree that around the situation at Kamino, kind of like how it plays out in the film, in terms of getting to Geonosis, that Obi-Wan is captured by the forces of Dooku and he's brought to Dooku.
Mhm.
My big thing is that Obi-Wan should either have someone with him or should have some way of communicating a message back to the Senate of the existence of the clone army and of the location that Dooku was basically behind the plot on the attack. And that should be his great heroic moment, getting that message out. And once that message is played to the Senate, of course, we should also not discount one thing, because Palpatine is already aware of all of this. Palpatine is already awaiting a message. And so it's actually, again, as with the assassination of Pelagius, was in part due to Palpatine sending the Jedi off to kill Pelagius. Palpatine is basically facilitating the passage of Obi-Wan's message to come back to the Senate, and thereby he can use that as the ultimate pretext to say there is a great new threat. There is a combining of all of these different systems. They have a new clone army, and the only way to effectively defend against it is to establish our own army. And maybe, this passes very sort of is barely passed, is a very contentious thing. But Palpatine basically has everything he wants in order to force through the creation of the military act. And
Mhm.
at the same time, you can say another key motivation could be that why is there a particular interest in capturing? Because I've already mentioned that I think that Padme should be captured. There is a huge amount of distrust around the Nemoidians, say, for example, in terms of rejoining with a Force user because of how Pelagius failed and they were beaten so horrifically in terms of their attack on Naboo. So in terms of, I almost see this as kind of like an act of proving fealty or proving loyalty. The Nemoidians set a task for Dooku, which is bring Padme back to us alive and ensure that Naboo will remain part of our empire in the future. You have to basically redeem what was lost to us under the promises of Pelagius. So combined to Obi-Wan's message, that the clone army has been created, maybe the attack on Anakin and Padme in Naboo and their abduction can also serve as more motivation to force the creation of the military act. And again, you can almost look to the first film and said, we thought this enemy had been defeated. No, the ugly head is raised again, and we need to come up with a complete and final solution to this problem and create an army which is going to rout all of these insidious forces. And that's where we leave Palpatine. Essentially, we don't know what's going on. Instead, all the characters meet up in Geonosis, and all we see effectively is kind of like how the film ultimately ended up. And we see a couple of Jedi come off to rescue them. And maybe we see a few untrained early sort of Republican soldiers in their very early stages. And what this means is that this is a very heroic endeavor by the Republic. You don't just see mountains of clone troopers being dropped in to fight, armies of droids. Rather, essentially all the forces have gathered on Geonosis to begin their invasion, or they're basically going to announce their secession from the Republic. And then all of a sudden, they have kept this secret. They don't even believe that Dooku and his affiliation with this is known. It's only known because of the intrepidness of Obi-Wan and his willingness to research and believe that Dooku could indeed defect. So out of nowhere, at the point of victory where Anakin, Padme, and Obi-Wan are basically being offered to the Separatists as trophies, essentially, the Republic launch. It's kind of like the the Doolittle raid. After Pearl Harbor, we see the Americans attempting to try and attack. Because again, we're looking into George Lucas's mind and always referencing boomer truth versions of World War II. In terms of the spirit of that, this would be very consistent in terms of you have the Pearl Harbor in the form of the attack on Coruscant, and this is the Doolittle raid in response to it, involving these plucky yet ultimately underdeveloped sort of new Republican army attachments of, real people, not clones. So there's a real palpable feeling of loss when they die. But there are enough to disrupt that meeting, and there are enough also to rescue those Jedi and bring them back. But in so doing, they suffer terrible losses. And I also think, kind of like in the exact same way that we have in the film, that Anakin should still be maimed in the situation by Dooku. And really, if anything, this, as you mentioned, there was the prospect of Obi-Wan falling to Dooku and basically assenting, and Dooku only therefore puts up Obi-Wan as a trophy because he has consciously rejected this.
Yes.
He wants essentially to save the Republic as is. He doesn't want to go and fight against them. He believes that ultimately Dooku has fallen, and he insinuates that maybe Dooku himself isn't aware of it, that Dooku is falling to the dark side, and that Obi-Wan can feel it, even though Dooku can't. So Dooku attacking Obi-Wan and Dooku maiming Anakin, really, you can say, marks his final descent into the dark side. If this is also a tragic fall of Dooku within the context of the entire story as well. And maybe it is the maiming of Anakin, and Anakin again trying to put himself on the line and save Padme, which finally confirms their love story, which has been obviously the consistent story throughout all of this. And I think really that's all that needs to be said about Attack of the Clones. I think, again, we've taken the basic structure of Attack of the Clones, and just by tweaking it a little bit, we've actually hopefully made it sound a little bit more coherent and a little bit more compelling. And I think maybe this is because Lucas can't understand character development. Maybe that's why, because the focus on our drafts is not so much reinventing massive plot points. I mean, regards to Attack of the Clones, I mean, it's basically a very simple story, but our big plot twist is the fact that the clone army is fighting for the Separatists and not fighting for the Republic. But all we've done is focus the story on the characters and their motivations. And all of a sudden, you have a far more compelling and interesting stories because it is character focused.
Yes.
And yet all the themes regarding the division of the Jedi, the fall and the schism within the Order and the transformation of the Republic, and Anakin's own, as we discussed, Anakin's motivations of wanting basically to feel emancipated from the Jedi, emancipated from slavery, and also maybe going over to Palpatine, because now who is responsible for rescuing Anakin in this situation? It's not the Jedi, it's Palpatine. Palpatine is the one responsible for sending over the Doolittle Raiders and the new sort of ranks of the Republican army to save them. So that establishes another core of their relationship. So all of these little things moving forward, all you have to do is prioritize the characters, and all of a sudden you can create a compelling narrative with changing actually very little.
Exactly. It's almost asking, why does somebody do something, and you then add depth to it, and those relationships have so much more meaning. I think, especially the one between Padme and Anakin. I think what you've suggested there really it adds more than just mere physical attraction. You actually understand why they're attracted to each other as people. So I think you're right there. One question I have just before we move on to Revenge of the Sith, because we haven't spoken about it too much, but you've sort of alluded to it there. In the first film, we were talking about this debate between the conservative and the more proactive Jedi, and obviously the conservative Jedi went out, and that's what partially leads to Dooku's joining the Separatists. You said some of the Jedi will appear at the end of the film with the Republican army.
Yes.
So
To
I wondered if you
me,
could say a little bit more
to
about that.
me, these are the Jedi who were basically supporting the original expedition in the first film, because the army has no officers. There has to be some form of advanced leadership within the Republican army. And of course, this is another way, looking into Palpatine's motivations of splitting the Jedi up. Basically, Palpatine is saying, well, we have this new army which is definitely not clones. These are real people. And if you do not join us, these real people will die, because you are the only ones who can provide tactical leadership to these people. You are the only ones who have a real sort of ability to defend the Republic. These people want to, but ultimately they are undertrained. They don't have experience. They need that leadership. So to me, the fact that so many people were willing to support going out and fighting Pelagius, the desire to save lives and to preemptively stop the separatist attack before it can even begin in Geonosis, is more than enough motivation to bring even more Jedi over to the cause of fighting on the side. And if anything, this intensifies the schism. And regarding all of this, this shouldn't be a shock to anyone, because through the discovery of Obi-Wan, we are recreating the reasons for Count Dooku's defection, why he feels dissatisfied with the Jedi. So we are essentially using the journey. It's not just a physical journey in terms of arriving at Kamino and finding out the dark secret. It's a journey it's going back through Dooku's past and understanding the trials and tribulations and the conflicts of many of these Jedi and arriving at this situation. And maybe if it's not obvious, someone could basically say this to Anakin, when Obi-Wan and Anakin ask, why did you do this? And they can say, well, if not, you wouldn't have had a hope. The separatists would now be attacking all of these star systems, and these people would be dying. So maybe it would actually confirm to Obi-Wan that there is some sort of middle position, that the Republic can be saved. You don't have to defect to the separatists. You don't have to necessarily fall to the dark side. That the Republic can be saved and the Jedi can be a potentially useful tool in resolving that. But little do they know that they are still ultimately the pawns of Sidious. They were the pawns of Sidious in the first film, and they are the pawns of Sidious in the second film, because they believe they're fighting to save the Republic, when in reality they are now the Gauleiters in, or rather the Reichsleiters in Palpatine's new army.
No, that's very true. And I also wonder if you can just there could be another element added to this, which is that, and this will relate to certain current events as well. It will become clear that the Jedi are very inconsistent to me, because I think few Jedi were willing to support Naboo, but when it's an attack upon Coruscant and it brings into question their own role within the Republic, especially with the creation of a Republic army, and they're supposed to be the defenders of the Republic. So are they being supplanted? Suddenly, many more of them are willing to go to war. So I
Yes, no,
think
I
you
think
know
that's
that
a crucial point as well. Yes,
yes. So I
and
think that could really come through, and certainly somebody like Yoda, who was the moderate position before,
yes, I think Yoda's.
joining the war.
Yes, I
Yeah.
think because in the film, it's not obvious why Yoda decides to join in the attack. Again, Yoda throughout the entire film series is basically nothing more than Sidious's plaything, even down to the fact when he is defeated by Sidious in the lightsaber duel. I do believe that Yoda's arrival on Geonosis, because I've actually had this mentioned down somewhere, but I forgot to mention it.
Mm.
Yoda's arrival on Geonosis should also be quite shocking in terms of no, he has now decided to take a side in this debate, and he's decided that an army needs to be created to defend the Republic, and we need to assume the role of crusaders, we need to assume the role of knights. A little bit of difference in terms of what I believe Yoda's role should be. I don't believe Yoda should fight Dooku. My belief is that Yoda should use his force ability to basically boost the morale of the New Republic soldiers. There's this idea called battle meditation, effectively, where
Hmm.
you're able to focus the abilities and the force energies of non-force users. And I believe that this way Yoda can actually be a real effective general as opposed to just another force user. And we can
Yeah.
see other applications of the force beyond just moving rocks. And we've already seen that with
Mm.
Sidious being able to assume different forms and being able to communicate covertly um, with Count Dooku. But I think Yoda assuming a general position and commanding rather than simply becoming a little warrior, essentially, makes him all the more compelling. And I think, if anything, emphasizes the need for Jedi to be instrumental in the creation of an army.
Yeah.
It shouldn't just be what we saw with the actual battle in Geonosis, which is hundreds of Jedi flinging lightsabers all around. No, it should be a lot of Jedi commanding and acting as officers, not being battle line troops, because there are very few Jedi. And if they die, ultimately, then
Hmm.
they can't be replaced given the huge amount of attention it takes to train them, all the years of training to get into that position. So I think little things like that can actually add to the film. And something I've toyed with, but I'm not actually sure about, is at the end whether Yoda is the one who consents to the marriage between Anakin and Padme. Because to me, kind of like with the disputes going on, especially within, I mean, at the moment within the Catholic Church, there is a synod on synodality going on, which is discussing many issues regarding this. But celibacy is obviously a core aspect of the more monastic beliefs of the Jedi. However, this is a very controversial position because the Jedi force children to enter the Jedi Order, which means that they are not taking a conscious decision to be celibate, rather they are having celibacy forced upon them, which is one of the reasons why so many Jedi have to undergo a process of such repression of the self, such repression of the will. Otherwise, they become dark force users, because obviously they would if they're having their freedom sapped from them in that sort of way. So maybe it could be a situation that, in addition to the fact that Yoda is willing to acknowledge the creation of an army and allow the Jedi to take a more active role, but maybe it'll be a politic decision to allow Anakin to marry Padme, both for reasons of ensuring that Naboo stays within the Republic and remains an important member, because there's a political rationale for that, but also to say that the Jedi Order can reform under these extreme situations, and we can actually show a bit of compassion to the poor children who we force to be celibate through no sort of desire of their own. And maybe again, in terms of a plot consideration for the Jedi, this furthers the schism between the more hardline members like Ki-Adi Mundi, who believe in strict celibacy and essentially not rushing into these sort of conflicts. And the irony, of course, of all of these is that we shouldn't be presenting either one of them as good. Because even though it would seem good on the surface that Yoda is wanting to be progressive, quote unquote, ultimately all he's doing is ensuring that Anakin will fall and the Jedi serve as nothing more than the foot soldiers of Palpatine. So I think in terms of layers of irony, I kind of have satisfaction in presenting both of these views, and both of these views are both right and wrong.
I think that's quite beautiful. And yeah, I think that'd be a really great kind of little addition in the epilogue of the film. Just on the as commanders, I was quite struck with a comparison with the original films when Ben Kenobi, what's his great force act in that film? It's when he is passed on from the material world, speaking to Luke to use the force. So I feel like you could have Yoda doing that for these Republic soldiers. You can hear his voice in their, or they can hear his voice
Yes.
in their minds. And maybe rather than Sidious approaching Dooku directly, could it be a voice that he's hearing?
So the only thing I would have against that is nothing to do with the prequels as they came out. It's the Darth Sidious thing to Kylo Ren. I have been
Yeah.
every voice inside your head. That thing. No, I
Yeah.
can't. I can
Okay.
understand in principle had the sequel films not come out, but I think that idea has been tarnished.
It has, but we have to pretend they don't exist, you know? We're redrafting before the sequels come out. I just thought it would be a nice tie-in with the originals, you know, it's
Well, I mean,
consistent.
it can be a voice, it can be an aspect. It can basically be, I mean, if we're going to pinch ideas from the sequels, it could be a force hologram, basically. He can
Mhm.
project an image of himself, or maybe he uses a conduit. It could even be a situation where we take Darth Maul. And
Mm.
maybe Darth Maul doesn't have any sort of direct relationship to Darth Plagueis's big fight at the end of Phantom Menace, but rather Darth Maul is seen, and maybe he is the one, I don't know, piloting that ship which shoots them down in the Phantom Menace. But maybe he comes back as basically another minion of Palpatine, a low-level minion, and
Mhm.
he is the conduit. And maybe no one knows who Darth Maul's allegiance is. It's not maybe even obvious that he's a Sith, but maybe Darth Maul is the one mentoring Count Dooku. We don't know. And again, maybe they can pretend rather innocuously that they are not Sith at all. They are simply non-Jedi affiliated Force users. There are many sort of ways in which Dooku can seek out other sources of advice or even more ancient forces in the world when trying
Yes.
to create this new identity independent of the Jedi Council.
Well, you see, well, this might be a good time to move to the Revenge of the Sith, and before we get into the kind of actual start and the story and so on, I would propose if we've got Maul still there, that scrap General Grievous and Maul essentially takes Grievous's role.
Yes, you don't need General Grievous at all. But I think if you're going to use Darth Maul in that position, Count Dooku should still be the baddie for the first half of the
Oh
third
yes,
film, in my
yes.
view. But Darth Maul is a very effective, again, strong man, effectively, kind of like
Hmm.
a lower tiered Indiana Jones villain. I can definitely understand that, but obviously Count Dooku still being the principal antagonist.
Oh, I agree. I just I feel like so with the death of um, Dooku, if we're sticking quite closely to the plot, well, Obi-Wan is sent off to find Grievous, but it would be much more effective if it's Maul. That he the last who's perceived as the last remnant of the separatist cause because he's been affiliated with Dooku at some point. So there's this kind of sense if we get rid of him, who's been this antagonist throughout, we'll have finally won the war. And I feel like that's much more effective given his presence throughout than Grievous, who suddenly appears in this film and we've never met before as a character. Don't really understand anything of his motivations or whatnot.
Well, it's worse than that. He is basically presented as the chief of the separatist forces out of nowhere, as if
Yeah.
you're supposed to already know who he is, but we have no idea who he is because he's never been presented to us before. But I think in terms of setting up a beginning, I'm going to
Hmm.
I want to keep that. I want to keep the battle over Coruscant,
Yes.
but I'm going to project it further into the film, if that's all right. I think the
Okay.
beginning, the beginning crawl of the movie should be, you know, through sort of great effort all across the Republic, troops have been sort of enlisting to defend the Republic and the new Grand Army, and Palpatine has assumed a charismatic role as the new leader, etc., etc. However, over the objections of the old sort of grandees of the Republic and the old Jedi who believe he's stayed in power too long and is amassing too much power in the form of all this sort of thing. However, the clone army has been halted. There is now an uneasy stalemate. And I think you can keep things like the attack on Kashyyyk, which is the attack on the Wookiee planet. And maybe throughout the first sort of bit of the film, the attack on Kashyyyk is perhaps the deciding theatre of one aspect of whether the clone army can be halted and whether the Republic can finally take the offensive back to the separatists. Um, and also, there should still be an issue regarding, at least how I view, how Padme has been able to relate and integrate these forces within the Grand Republic army. For Padme's sake, you can say she's still trying to retain the independence of Naboo, and so she has amassed her own private army of Naboo, her own professional army, refusing to annex it to let it be annexed by the Grand Army of the Republic. And maybe she has become a war leader, kind of like fighting alongside Anakin
Mm.
in this situation. And again, this could be a full culmination of her character, that at the beginning of The Phantom Menace, she is weak. She has been forced into this position through the early and, possibly, assassination of her father. And now she's finally assumed the role of war leader of Naboo. But ironically, she is fighting two enemies. She's fighting the Separatists and the Nemoidians, but she's also fighting her own Senator Chancellor in the form of Palpatine, both of whom provide sort of great threats to her independence. So I think in terms of Padme having a enduring character throughout all of
Mm.
this, I have no idea why Lucas decided to contrive a situation where queens had term limits and children could become queens. I don't know where that idea came from, but having her stay as queen just
Mm.
makes so much more sense in every possible respect in terms of her investment in this conflict. But I think in terms of the situation in Kashyyyk, um, there should be a situation early on in the film where Anakin and Padme are fighting alongside each other, but Anakin has been forced to be recalled to fight alongside Obi-Wan to be able to defend something like Kashyyyk. And maybe it is from that situation that we contrive some sort of battle with a Darth Maul. I mean, it really sort of doesn't matter, um, like the actual sort of mechanics of the war, but the same things happen. Instead of Grievous dying, Darth Maul is killed, Kashyyyk is protected, and the ultimate conflict that should evolve out of this is what we're going to do in the event of victory, and what the Jedi Order are going to do in the event of victory. Because this war has been going on for 5 or 10 years at this point. Kashyyyk is basically kind of like the turning point in this conflict. You can almost say it's kind of like D-Day. The war is coming to an
Mm.
end, will be over within a few months, now that Darth Maul has been killed. But the faction under Yoda, who had basically led the charge for forming a Republic army, are now losing that battle in the Jedi Council against Ki-Adi-Mundi, who are saying now, well, this army cannot be allowed to become a permanent fixture when the separatists are defeated. We need to return to our separatist past, and we need to force Chancellor Palpatine from office. So maybe another key point in the development between Anakin's relationship with the Council is that Anakin is responsible for having killed Darth Maul. The Jedi now have an opportunity to continue on the fight and to destroy all the last elements of the Separatists.
Hmm.
But it is at this moment, unlike in the film where basically Obi-Wan inexplicably is sent off to end the war on his own, at the point that Darth Maul dies and it looks as if the Separatists can finally be defeated, the Jedi recall Anakin and instead focus him on spying on the Chancellor. In that way, the Jedi see the Chancellor as the greater threat than the Separatists, and this caused even more division within the ranks of the Jedi. I think in terms of building up the first act, I think that's a good way of sort of presenting it. All these figures have become, battle weary. They become more grizzled. They become harder. Anakin is able to win a great victory with Obi-Wan, fighting alongside him at Kashyyyk. But now we're looking to the future, and it's very obvious that the Jedi Council are focused on removing the Chancellor. The Chancellor, by all accounts, who is immensely popular, and who now has a massive galaxy-spanning army at his command, with the Jedi placed in key positions.
I would maybe add just a couple of touches to this, because I think this is a really great setup, and that would just be that the attack on Kashyyyk, the situation would be that Kashyyyk has been taken over by the Separatists, the Wookiees have been enslaved,
Yes.
and the Republic forces, a bit like D-Day, they're coming up the beach and so on. So you've got that imagery. But crucially for Anakin, he sees the power of the Republic army to liberate slaves. And knowing his own context.
It's even better. It's even better than that. Are you
Okay.
familiar with the extended material and Wookiees on the topic of slavery and life debts? Let's just say there's a lot of conversation around the history of enslaved Wookiees. So
Okay.
the idea of enslaving Wookiees in particular, and using that in Kashyyyk, and again, using that for Anakin as a vehicle for liberating the oppressed population of Wookiees on Kashyyyk, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant.
Yes, and then so he has a real attachment then to seeing the benefit of the army and what he thinks can be done with it, with the Jedi leading it across the Republic and across all the planets. So the dissolution of that, the threat of dissolution of the Republic army, would cause him great. Well, he would be in conflict with the majority of the council just on that basis alone.
Well,
And
I
that is
mean,
consistent with his character, but it's not really fleshed out too strongly in the film. He just says certain things at certain points about, it'd be good if we had a strong leader, if we did
no, I mean
the
this
right.
is brilliant. I mean, we're taking the crumbs that we've been provided from the films and we're actually developing them, which is more than George Lucas could have done. But yes, in this situation, the strong generalissimo liberating slaves, given Anakin's experience, could be a very potent argument for some form of strongman rule. And indeed, it could help buttress his relationship with Palpatine,
With
because
Palpatine, yes.
Palpatine would be the figure most responsible for this. And right at the moment when Darth Maul is killed at Kashyyyk, and it looks as if we can finally win the war, what is the Jedi Council focused on? It's focused on removing Palpatine from office and using Anakin to spy. And basically, for the Jedi, this is a test of loyalty. They know that Anakin is unreliable. And so they're using this essentially as a way they're spying on Anakin, spying on Palpatine at the same time. And Anakin isn't an idiot like he's presented in the films. He's fully aware of what's going on, yet he doesn't know what to do. This to him is a total conundrum. He is a Jedi. He owes his allegiance to the Jedi, yet he also owes his allegiance to the Republic, and the Chancellor is at its head. So he's going through this excruciating period of conflicted loyalties. And to make it worse, I'm going to continue on in the spirit of Revenge of the Sith. Anakin still has visions of Padme's death. It's not death in childbirth. It's just he has visions of her death. If anything, his visions of her death come from conflict or something, because she has actually become a war leader in this situation. And he goes to seek Yoda. And rather in the film, where Yoda basically just says, let go of all these sort of ridiculous attachments, etc., he basically says, well, patience, wait until this conflict is over and, we'll see what happens. But you're sensing sort of you're sensing a future that can be, but not a future that will be, essentially. But then he confides to Palpatine because he doesn't know where else to go. And Palpatine in this situation has basically become a father figure. And rather than Palpatine basically saying that, oh, well, Darth Plagueis told me to save, women in childbirth, which is almost verbatim what he does in the film, Palpatine instead stokes Anakin's hatred of the Jedi directly when he says, well, You know the Jedi are plotting to have me removed, don't you, Anakin? Well, what do you think they're going to do when they have me removed? They're going to force you to abandon Padme because you have married her in contravention of the rules of the Jedi. Once Padme is no longer needed, you will no longer be in a position to protect her. And when you're not in a position to protect her, she may be killed. That's a very logical sort of standpoint for him to argue that the Jedi are actually trying to precipitate the cause of Padme's death. And I think that's a far more coherent motivation for Anakin to see Palpatine as his real protector rather than the Jedi. What do you think of that?
It definitely is more logical, and I think there's a lot of strength to those elements. And yes, I think there's it makes more sense if she's already a war leader that he's going to have visions that she might die, and indeed that strengthens the case for having a Republic army that he's leading because he can then protect Padme with it. I think the one thing that I think is appealing about Sidious's kind of insinuation, I can teach you that how to save Padme using the Force, is it very much taps into that kind of Faustian bargain, dealing with the unnatural. I'm going to make a deal with the devil to do something which breaks the laws of nature, but it's worth it because I love this woman so much. So it kind of blends
But see
two
to
big
me,
archetypes,
see to
which is a
me,
very powerful concoction, I think.
see to me, I don't view this as it should just be stated in one scene. My view is that this is a process. So this is the beginning of that process. He
Okay,
appeals
right.
he appeals to political logic first. Then there is a situation that'll emerge later in the film where it looks like she has been seriously injured and she's on the precipice of dying. She's critically wounded. And then it is at that point that Anakin may be induced into forming some sort of Faustian pact. Because if anything, that makes Anakin's motivations far more understandable.
Yeah.
He's not betraying everything he believes in due to a dream, but due to an actual tangible prospect of Padme dying in this situation, where if he doesn't do anything quickly, she may actually die, as opposed to simply visions of inexplicable death and childbirth. I believe a slow escalation where Palpatine is able to provide numerous reasons as to why. Essentially, first of all, Palpatine does it by arguing that Anakin should be independent. And this again appeals to his experience with slavery. He looks on Palpatine as his benefactor because Palpatine is the only voice of reason he can look to beyond that of his Jedi mentors. And Obi-Wan, of course, can't directly defy the Council, so he can't offer the sort of advice that Palpatine can. At the same time, Anakin is enamored of Palpatine because he has been able to build something out of nothing, which is the strong republic, which is going to ensure peace and prosperity and wipe out corruption as he experienced, in extremis during his situation in Tatooine. Now he's appealing to the rules of the Jedi themselves as a way which is actually going to stymie and destroy his ability to protect Padme. And then ultimately it'll be a question over power itself, that Faustian pact. So I believe giving Anakin myriad escalating motivations, I think benefits everyone. It compounds those reasons and actually gives so much more depth to both characters, both in terms of Palpatine's ability to manipulate and his foresight, but also Anakin's own agency in this situation, that he can see where his own self-interest lies and the interests of Padme, and it is not with the Jedi. He believes that if the Jedi conservatives win and remove Palpatine, that the monastic rules will be imposed and that Anakin and all of his aspirations for independence and his life with Padme will be destroyed. And that is the seed which grows in Anakin's mind, which causes him to eventually discard the ways of the Jedi. But in terms of the discovery that Palpatine is a Sith Lord, I don't believe it should come necessarily from the way that we essentially find it out, where he basically just says, maybe that comes later. But I think it would be, well, actually, no, just thinking about it now, maybe it can be that Sidious is given enough away where Anakin believes there's something wrong here. He doesn't quite know what it is, but he's not going to point to Sidious being a Dark Lord of the Sith, especially when all of the Dark Lords he has faced have been on the opposing side. It wouldn't
Right.
really make much sense for Palpatine to also be a Sith Lord, albeit maybe he believes he's a Force user and he's found some ability to suppress it, because this man has uncanny charisma and ability to control events beyond that of normal Jedi. But Anakin doesn't have evidence to be able to piece this all together and say that he's a Dark Lord. Remember also that Count Dooku only belatedly realizes that Sidious is, Palpatine. And this to me is the big decision. Once Maul has been defeated, and it looks like the forces of the Separatists are about to be undone after their decisive defeat at Kashyyyk, the attack on Coruscant is the last sort of great option that the Separatists have to be able to bring the war to a speedy conclusion. And Dooku believes that the best way to win the war for the Separatists is to abduct Palpatine. And once he's abducted Palpatine, like we see in the original film, and once he's abducted Palpatine, he will inform the Jedi that Palpatine is in fact a Sith Lord. I'm not exactly sure of the mechanics, but I think it's fair to say that Dooku is intelligent enough to piece together all of the things regarding his own mentorship, that he finally comes to a realization on his own before Anakin does, that Palpatine is in fact, maybe it's due to logistics, maybe there was something on Kashyyyk that only Dooku knew, and maybe that was the cause for their ultimate defeat. Maybe it was a bit of intelligence that there was no way Palpatine could have known unless he had been in communication with Dooku this entire time. Because that's been another theme regarding Palpatine, is that Palpatine's in the privileged position to see the battle plans of both sides. He uses this to remove Plagueis. He uses this to commence the attack on Geonosis and bring news of the clone army to create the Republican army. And maybe it's finally a nugget of information like this, which allows Dooku to finally contrive that, actually, no, I've been betrayed. This man is Palpatine. So having abducted Palpatine, and Dooku basically saying, actually, no, this man's a Sith Lord. Why that is such a brilliant ploy for Dooku is that the army is completely loyal to Palpatine. The Senate is basically, divided on this issue. Half the senators want things to return to, the corrupt old ways of before. The other senators are more than willing to say, well, actually, no, we've got peace and security with Palpatine, so we'll go with Palpatine. And the Jedi are now confronted. Well, okay, this entire time we've potentially been supporting a Sith Lord. But if we don't help the Sith Lord, if we allow him to be killed, everything we have fought for in the last sort of 10 years will completely collapse. So many of the Jedi rationalize this and saying, maybe Dooku is just saying this because he knows it'll divide us. Maybe we should go and save Palpatine anyway. Because there is never a reason in the film as to why Palpatine is abducted. Not really any at all. What the ultimate sort of strategy is here. But I think I found a way to justify why it was such an intelligent move by Dooku to believe that the abduction of Palpatine and the insinuation that he was a Sith would basically cause the Republic to collapse, because it would cause the Jedi to fight against the army. And also use Dooku could use Palpatine as a bargaining chip, essentially, to negotiate a peace in that situation. And of course, in the film, it's just so completely stupid because you have no idea what Dooku's real relationship is with Sidious and why he's completely prepared to be executed by Anakin. Did he consent to this? Was there a prior agreement? We never know. But kind of like Plagueis, where Palpatine is actually the one indirectly responsible for having his master bumped off by the Jedi. I think it's fitting in a way that here we have a pseudo apprentice of Sidious, an unwitting apprentice of Sidious, who's basically saying, I have been betrayed. You have all been betrayed. The real enemy is Palpatine, because Palpatine has been behind it all this entire time. I think that's quite a good plot twist.
I think that would be good, and it raises the stakes again. And so would you have Anakin and Obi-Wan going to free Palpatine?
This is the thing. I don't believe Obi-Wan would. I believe in his heart of hearts, Obi-Wan knows that Palpatine probably is a Sith Lord, even
Right.
though he thinks that it will destroy the Republic. I think Obi-Wan sees no choice. And I think this, if anything, adds to the sort of tragedy of it all. Ki-Adi-Mundi is completely convinced, oh, just ground all the Jedi, just leave him to die.
Yeah.
All of the Republican, officers, the Jedi Corps integrated into the army, just stand down. We're going to have nothing to do with this. Just let Dooku, kill him, and that'll solve our problem. Anakin, however, won't do this, because Anakin believes that, he has that attachment to Palpatine, which none of the other Jedi have. So my compromise here is that Anakin goes off solo to try and rescue Palpatine. Obi-Wan confronts him, but Obi-Wan effectively lets him go, realizing
Hmm.
that he doesn't have enough moral stature or an argument to effectively stop Anakin from doing what he wants to do, because he himself doesn't believe in any situation there's any sort of viable outcome here. So he trusts Anakin enough to know that he thinks he's making the best decision, even though Obi-Wan himself is confused in this matter. And I think that's a much better way of sort of leaving it off, that Anakin has been given that benefit of the doubt by Obi-Wan, that he's not going to turn to the dark side. And if anything, I believe that compounds the tragedy.
Yeah, I think that works. And so then once that's happened, he's defeated Dooku. What's the next stage? Because obviously we've moved things around here. So yeah, because that's the kind of fun adventure actually in the Revenge of the Sith for Obi-Wan and Anakin. But that's now the battle on Kashyyyk or
Yes,
wherever
and
it is.
this is the sort of tragic end of their
Yes.
relationship. This is the moment where Obi-Wan realizes he can go no further, but at the
Hmm.
same time he has no right to stop Anakin in doing what he believes to be best, because he understands that Anakin only has good motivations here. Anakin is not whisking off to murder the younglings in the situation. He's going off to save the Republic. That's what he believes Anakin's motivation is in this situation. And Obi-Wan is not convinced of this, so he's letting Anakin make his own decisions, which again is the whole point of Anakin's character here, is that Anakin is wanting to be emancipated from all of these various forces who want to control him. So maybe
Hmm.
for Obi-Wan, the greatest gift you can give him is, as his master, letting him go off and making his own choice, even if he doesn't necessarily believe it's the right choice. In this situation, I think it has to be a matter where you almost recreate the situation where Dooku is killed by Anakin in some way, and that effectively should be the final point at which Anakin pledges himself towards Palpatine. And again, maybe this is a situation, perhaps Padme could join him on this conflict, and Padme could be injured in the situation. And you can say that Anakin's mind, his judgment, is somehow being impaired in the situation. You could draw any sort of extra sort of motivation you need for Anakin to be finally convinced by Palpatine to join him, and for Palpatine to openly admit that he's essentially a Dark Lord of the Sith, but it doesn't matter because you saved the Republic. So what does it matter if you're a Jedi or a Sith? I've clearly proven myself to be the good guy during this entire situation. You've had your own problems with the Jedi. Why are they so much better than the Sith in this situation? You have seen other iterations, but I am not that. I am not a Pelagius. I am not a Darth Maul. I have clearly shown that the Sith can be a force for peace and stability within the galaxy. I do believe there should be a final sort of confrontation between those two characters, and Anakin makes a reluctant recognition, combined with the fact that he knows he's not necessarily powerful enough to save Padme and protect her, that he needs the protection of Palpatine in order to protect Padme. There are many different reasons you can contrive it, but I think the final act which confirms him as Darth Vader has to be when he kills an unarmed Dooku. And again, this goes back to his motivation over revenge, because Dooku has been so responsible for leading the Separatist attack.
Hmm.
Dooku had defected from the Jedi and basically betrayed the memory of Qui-Gon Jinn, and Dooku had also maimed Anakin in a previous conflict. So Anakin has every motivation to hate Dooku for what he's done. And so, as with the real Palpatine in the situation, Palpatine can basically say that this is righteous anger. what you're doing. And maybe he doesn't. I mean, it's so ridiculous in the film that you have this evil Palpatine having completely sort of shorn off the image of, the nice, congenial senator. And then he says, go off and kill everyone in the temple. Go off and kill the younglings. Go off and kill all the separatist leaders. It's so much better just to have, okay, you're removing Dooku. You've destroyed the separatists effectively. And we are going to go down together and we are going to bring peace to the Republic. And he's not basically saying we will fight the Jedi. He's saying, we will have to see what the Jedi present, what terms the Jedi will present to us, essentially. But we together will stand and we will defend the Republic. I think even then, Palpatine still needs to couch it in terms which are sufficient to seduce Anakin. Because, again, what I hated about Anakin's character in the films is that he has so little motivation. I mean, just think about it for a second. Anakin becomes Darth Vader after having essentially saved Palpatine's life from Mace Windu attempting to murder Palpatine. That is and he goes from saving Palpatine's life to I'm going to kill all the younglings on the same day. If you think about it, it is not the execution of Dooku. It is saving Palpatine's life that convinces him to go off and kill the younglings. It is insane in the films how it is ultimately contrived. And
I
so
think it can be defended, though. I think,
How?
because it's just one line of dialogue, and that's the problem. It could be so much more expanded. But Sidious essentially says, if you do this, you will become powerful enough to save Padme. So there's this idea of if you do these terrible things, you will grow in the power of the dark side.
Yes, but Anakin
be
needs
able
to be
to do what you
convinced.
need to
Anakin
do.
needs to be convinced of that. Again, it destroys his entire character essentially to say, well, this crazy man who looks like some sort of devil is now telling me that I need to charge up my evil power by murdering indiscriminately, and then I will have the power to heal. I mean, it's insane. It's completely insane. And again, it robs Anakin of any sort of sense, prior sort of logic or anything. And also, we have established his relationship with Padme, but
Yes.
his relationship with Padme goes beyond his affection for her. It's more about him being able to find his own sort of independent existence post-slavery and post the Jedi. It's as much for him as it is for her, and his own belief in trying to forge a new way in the Republic, fighting corruption and all of these things. Him going off and murdering younglings indiscriminately destroys every other aspect of his character. There has to be some way of sparing him, and in my version, he doesn't kill younglings at all. In fact, there is an insinuation that Anakin, essentially, they go down from the planet, except it's going to be triumphant. Anakin has, the Republican forces, the Republican fleet, they have defeated the separatists. The flagship has been captured by Anakin. They descend down, and what should be, applause and, a triumph, essentially, that the war is finally over. Instead, the Jedi take that opportunity to basically confront Palpatine and say, you are under arrest pending investigation for these accusations made by Dooku. And this is a very impolitic thing to do, of course, because he is at his highest sort of public profile, and they're choosing this moment to finally confront him. And there's really nothing else they can do in this situation because politically he's untouchable. So the only thing they can really do is try and arrest him as quickly and as quietly as possible. And of course, Palpatine plays into this. He refuses to. Obviously, he doesn't recognize the authority of the Jedi. And then in a similar situation to what we see in the film, let's say any Jedi, it could be Mace Windu, attacks Palpatine. And Palpatine is basically able to make this a public situation where everyone can see the horror that has been inflicted on the Chancellor by the Jedi. And it is again Anakin who goes in and saves Palpatine, therefore confirming his allegiance to him by killing Mace. But crucially, Palpatine never takes out a lightsaber or anything. He hides his usage of the Force and willingly distorts his face so as to appear maimed, even though he has the ability to force block whatever Mace is basically throwing at him. And This therefore becomes a great public spectacle rather than something happening in closed doors, and you basically have to take his word on all of this happening. And rather than a group of clone troopers going off to storm the Jedi Temple and kill all the younglings, instead there was a lynch mob surrounding the Jedi Temple, basically saying these people have now tried to kill our Chancellor. These people are trying to overthrow the Republic. So, if anything, this can really sort of underline now the Jedi have become essential pariahs, and it is not simply a matter of Palpatine doing this fait accompli and telling the whole world. It's rather everyone can see this, and the Jedi have basically brought their own destruction upon themselves. And Anakin himself is very conflicted by this. Palpatine convinces him, okay, well, go off and execute their leadership. Go off and kill Ki-Adi-Mundi, because if he escapes, the Jedi will simply create a new separatist movement. We need to eliminate them now before they can spread and instigate conflict. However, again, promises that the Padawans will be spared. And the insinuation here is, of course, that Palpatine lies to him and he ensures that every single Jedi in that temple is killed, but Anakin is none the wiser. Anakin perhaps doesn't necessarily believe Palpatine, but at that point he's already sold his soul and he's essentially be given no choice. I would like to hear, I mean, obviously I put forward my view in terms of the end of the Republic, but what do you have in terms of the final battle, the death of Padme, and the ending of the films?
Well, just before I get to that, I just want to say I thought that's a really great setup, and the way of executing the destruction of the Jedi without it destroying Anakin's character. I thought you did a really good job of that.
There should be no orders. I know what Order 66 in Lucas's mind means. It's basically the Night of Long Knives.
Yes.
But you don't need that. If anything, to me, it's more powerful when it is the people of the Republic themselves who want to destroy the Jedi. And Anakin is looking at this, thinking he doesn't necessarily know if he's in the right or the wrong. He's not being consciously evil in this situation. You can look at Anakin and say that he does genuinely believe, by doing what he's doing, that he's bringing peace and stability to the Republic, and that the Jedi, in attempting to arrest Palpatine, are merely attempting to take over. So I think I prefer having that moral sort of ambiguity in this situation. On the one hand, it's clear that all of these things have been orchestrated and manipulated by Palpatine. Yet on the other hand, it is very clear that the Jedi can't offer any alternative to Palpatine in this situation. And that, in a sense, is enough to convince Anakin that Palpatine is the better option out of the two, combined with all the insinuations he's made over Padme.
Well, and also, you've just had Dooku on the ship kidnap Palpatine, and he's ultimately been trying to take over the Republic. He's a fallen Jedi. The parallels with what then the Jedi try to do as soon as Palpatine gets off the ship.
Yes, exactly. He believes this is another situation of Dooku. He has, again, it's a wonderful parallel. He has defeated Dooku, and now he has defeated Mace Windu in the guise of Dooku. Again, all he sees is enemies of the Republic.
And the lynch mobs have the same attitude too.
Exactly, and they have a justification.
They're all Dooku. Yeah.
They have a justification, yeah.
So I think that's a good setup. And then, I would still keep it that Yoda and Obi-Wan survive. And
you have to have that situation, really.
No, I agree. I just mean only them. I know there's a lot of expanded stuff and the Disney stuff where there's loads of Jedi that survive.
No, I agree with you. I think they are the only ones that really can survive. Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's really important as well from the original trilogy standpoint, where like the Jedi, some people don't even think they like. It seems like people have forgotten they existed almost, or that their presence in the galaxy is very minimal by that time.
Well, you can understand. You can understand it. I mean, this is kind of like damnation in memory, isn't it? That the Jedi have, on the one hand, presented themselves as guardians of peace and justice in the Republic, and yet it was a fallen Jedi who led the Separatist rebellion, and it was the Jedi Council who decided to assassinate the one man most responsible for bringing peace and stability to the Republic. So essentially, the Jedi had been consigned to the ash heap as the harbingers of doom in this situation. They are seen as the heralds of the end of the Republic, whereas Palpatine is seen as saving it. And if anything, this should, again, make Palpatine's character that much more interesting, that you can honestly associate him as a potentially good character. And maybe this is beyond Lucas's capability. Maybe as a result of this, the kitsch Palpatine, the cheesy Palpatine, the unlimited power Palpatine would have to be toned down in this situation. I think the only way you can get that Palpatine is if the attack by Yoda proceeds as we see in the original film. And essentially Yoda has, he's lost everything. He's lost the Jedi. He doesn't know where Obi-Wan is. I don't think there should be a conscious decision. I think Obi-Wan maybe has separated. I think maybe at this point, Obi-Wan has decided to flee to Naboo and to try and, find Padme or whatever. Again, Padme's situation in this, I haven't made clear what Padme's role in this. And frankly, I don't have a clear opinion of what Padme's role in all of this is. Because we've talked about the Freudian Pact, not the Freudian Pact, the Faustian Pact, the Faustian Pact. And your view is very much, yes, maybe that was a Freudian slip on the Faustian Pact, but your view has been that it has to be a concept of power regarding the seduction. And my view is that it's based on pragmatism. It's based on his desire for independence and his desire to protect Padme, rather than any imminent sense that he needs more power in order to save her in that sense. In my situation, I can't really contrive a way in which he needs more power in order to save Padme, because I think following my escalation, it's sufficient. He has a sufficient motivation enough to stand with Palpatine against the Jedi Council without the demands for more literal power in the sense of increasing his force usage. So maybe in my situation, Obi-Wan goes off and tries to find Padme and tell her what's going on, try to get her to convince Anakin to come back to the light side. And Yoda has stayed on Coruscant, and Yoda has no other option but to try and kill Palpatine. And maybe by killing Palpatine, it finally sort of wrests the Republic away from the Sith. And maybe in that situation, it can really be a mask off moment where Palpatine can just reveal just the sheer monster he has become. He has been obviously repressing this character for decades and decades and decades, not revealing his power levels ultimately. And then all of a sudden we get to the unlimited power moment, because on a superficial note, I want to see that Palpatine because I love it so much in the third film. It's what redeems the third film. And I think if you have to have an outlet for it, and maybe also in terms of a character revelation, a revelation of Palpatine's sheer hate for the Jedi, sustained hate of the Jedi, he can take it out on Yoda and his desire to almost irrationally destroy Yoda at all costs. And maybe it's at this point where Yoda can basically say, I know you killed the younglings. I know you had the Padwans killed. I know you tricked Anakin, all of these things. And maybe finally, moving beyond the genial character and the manipulation, Palpatine can just revel in it, revel in the sheer sort of situation he's created. I don't know. I think maybe for the audience also it'll be quite some satisfaction to get that complete mask off moment from Palpatine, given the fact that to Anakin, he's very much been placed in the role of manipulator. He has not shown the full capacity for evil, whereas to Yoda, there is no reason for him to conceal that side of him anymore. What do you think of that?
I think that certainly in the conflict between Yoda and Palpatine, that would be a good time to reveal that side of him. Because, as you say, Yoda is the symbolic representation of the Jedi. And, it's utterly defeated now. And Palpatine can just revel in that moment, hidden away from the public. He can really let rip and just allow that pure... I guess it's like kind of that malice, that reveling in malice and delight over the destruction and suffering of the Jedi is something that would be very powerful to see in relation to Yoda in particular.
I think it's very important to emphasize the two sides of him, because it's not really something you get in
Hmm.
the main trilogy when you see Palpatine as evil Palpatine. But I really think, if you're going to get statues, you're going to get, voice recordings or, speeches. Palpatine shouldn't be presenting himself in his hood. Palpatine should
No.
be presenting himself, even if it requires some sort of force magic in order to project an image that's benign. He needs to create an image that is benign and imperious, sublime in a way, and regal to the population. But in reality, when all these affectations, illusions have been dispelled in front of Yoda, the true malevolent force is revealed. And I think in that sense, it could be a far more devastating moment when people really see what's happened and what Anakin, you can almost see sympathy for Anakin in the fact that Anakin has betrayed the Jedi, but Anakin has not seen exactly what he has surrendered to. And I think this is also another reason why you should remove every single hologram of Sidious and a hood. So when we have this moment, it's that much more impactful.
I would even add, I would add two things to that. I think the first is that I actually think the way Sidious should frame, um, the destruction of the Jedi by the mobs and then the Republic Army is a war on religion, essentially. That this is religion is the cause of the problems. Both the Jedi, Dooku, so on, the Force users. We need to eradicate them from society to establish peace, and that would help. Because later on in A New Hope, you've got these officers who are talking about
Your
Vader's
devotion
religion,
to your that sad old religion,
sad
and
religion.
instead the mob are transformed into the legions of the militant godless. I see.
Yeah, so I think that would play in quite nicely, and you've got a character like Han Solo who's saying things like ancient religions are no match for a blaster. So this attitude's quite prevalent within the world of A New Hope. So I think Palpatine being the source of that and framing it in that way would be quite a good way, and it also protects him because he's not revealing he's a Force user. He's setting himself against Force users
Yes,
in
absolutely. He
public.
is he is he is the antithesis of the Force user. The Force user is responsible for all of these great calamities, and so he has
Yes.
positioned himself in total opposition to that. Essentially, he represents the triumph over the Force, despite being a Force user in himself. Hence, the necessity of concealing that part of himself in terms of his public persona, and only revealing that to a very select few, if really at all. But of course, in Yoda's situation, he has no reason to hold anything back.
No, and I think so. I think that's a really good juxtaposition. And then so I'm almost wondering with Obi-Wan, because you're right. There's a difficulty here in how do you then get to the point A of Anakin um, having to deal with Padme's death and some kind of bargain in that respect, or and also how are Anakin and Obi-Wan going to meet? One possibility would be with the collapse of the Jedi Order, rather than killing Yoda, Yoda is taken as an instrument to be tortured. Essentially, Palpatine uses him to for his own delight, and that's where you see the true revelation of who Palpatine is, and Anakin
Mm.
has to witness this. And Obi
I,
Wan,
I
sorry,
wouldn't, I
go ahead.
wouldn't, I wouldn't see Anakin witnessing that. To be honest, I think Palpatine would be sufficiently aware that that wouldn't be a winning strategy, given the fact that Anakin has only tentatively gone over to the dark side at this point. But I can certainly understand there might be a certain satisfaction in capturing him alive. And if
Hmm.
anything, that makes Yoda's situation all the bit more heroic, that he's escaping capture rather than he's the instigator of a failed assassination attempt. And that, of course, both appeals to my scenario and the scenario in the film. I think your escape from capture makes
Hmm.
Yoda a more sort of valorous character, in a sense that he's going to save the Jedi principles rather than risk everything on a failed assassination plot. I think, going back to my point in the sense that there isn't a very tangible threat to Padme. The reason she goes back to Naboo during this time is to have Leia and to have
Mm.
Luke. That's the reason she's been separated from Anakin, and that's the reason she hasn't been, with Anakin during all of these events. She has been in the late stages of pregnancy, and she's given birth. Obi-Wan, of course, has gone over to Naboo and tells a post-pregnant Padme what has in fact occurred. And Padme is concerned for various reasons. She's actually, if anything, she's less concerned that he's gone over to the dark side because she doesn't really know what that means in the grand scheme of things. She's always been ambivalent towards the Jedi. She has a personal connection to Obi-Wan, of course, to Qui-Gon, and to Yoda because of their relationship. But in terms of the Jedi per se, she basically believes that they were the ones trying to prevent Anakin and her being together, and they were trying to control Anakin. So she's ambivalent towards the fate of the Jedi, but she is concerned that Palpatine is essentially trying to dupe him and control him. And through Palpatine, Anakin is basically going to betray her, and Naboo is basically going to become a colony of the Empire. So I think politically and in terms of personal motivation, she has enough motivation to go out and try to convince Anakin that something, horrible may happen, and you need to establish some sort of distance or independence from Palpatine and gain some perspective on the situation. But I think the only way you can actually tragically contrive the situation is if Anakin murders Padme. I think that has to be the ultimate sort of tragic scenario for seeing the images of death, trying to prevent her death and try to be her protector, but ultimately he's the one responsible for killing her. And maybe there has to be another scene where Palpatine is able to convince Anakin even further of all the evils that the Jedi have essentially brought to the galaxy. Maybe that's also confirmed in the scene with Dooku, where Anakin becomes wholly committed against the Jedi, and this is confirmed with the attempted assassination by Mace Windu on the Chancellor as he comes back. So, kind of like we see in the film, when Obi-Wan is basically escorting Padme over, Padme has, her little speech, and it's not, the only thing I need is your love. You've killed younglings. Instead, I want you to come back to Naboo, and I want us to raise our children. I want to rule over my people, and I want you to protect my people and our children, etc. Very clear motivation. I don't want you just to become a minion of the new emperor. I want you to help build a new life together now that the war is over, etc., etc. More rational motivations as opposed to I've died of a broken heart, etc. And then Obi-Wan basically confronts when Anakin is not really convinced. And maybe, I know this sounds a cheap way of getting out of this situation, but maybe it is like in the film when Obi-Wan arrives, he believes that Obi-Wan has basically attempted to manipulate her into turning against him, as all the Jedi have been attempting to manipulate him to turn against the Chancellor. And maybe this is a final straw. Maybe he tries to attack Obi-Wan, and in the altercation that transpires, Padme tries to defend Obi-Wan and tries to split them up, and maybe inadvertently Padme gets killed in the crossfire. Because I can't see a situation where Anakin's motivation is strong enough where he's just going to kill Padme for that reason. I think the only way I can sort of contrive it is by saying that Padme is trying to spare both of them and trying to reconcile them, and she gets killed in the ensuing conflict. And if anything, that death as a result of that causes Anakin to become so enraged against Obi-Wan that it is the moment, in the same way that you can see the parallel in the previous film, where him sparing the slave master who killed Shmi saved Anakin from falling to the dark side, that the death of Padme results in his final fall to the dark side, because he has not really fallen to the dark side at the moment. He has committed himself to the defense of the Republic, even if that means fighting the Jedi. Unlike in the film, where he goes around and murders the separatist leaders and murders the younglings, and you can see the Sith eyes, and you can see him cackling. You can see him cackling in front of Padme and saying, we will make the world as we see fit. Exactly, I'm more powerful than the Emperor. I can overthrow him. No, get rid of all that. But it is the death of Padme that
Mm.
finally removes all aspect of humanity, which he's been able to hold together since his tragic upbringing, and causes him to lash out at Obi-Wan with such vitriol and such hatred that he has become the object of everything he despises. He is the last Jedi, he believes, and he has been responsible for murdering Padme, basically his sole reason to keep going, other than just blind service to the Emperor. In terms of trying to contrive a situation, that's the best I can do, I'm afraid, unless I give it a lot more thought. Someone is saying it cannot be an accident, it must be an evil act of murder. I can't see anything in Anakin's character where he kills Padme in a premeditated fashion, I'm afraid. I also believe that his attempt to kill Padme in the films is incredibly sort of contrived in a way. In the same way that, I really don't see there's enough motivation for Obi-Wan to be attacked by Anakin in that situation really at all. It's almost so ridiculous. I laugh at that scene, as horrible as that sort of as horrible as that sort of seems. But I only sort of view a accidental death as the only way of a crime of passion is enough. Like I said, it was an accident. He didn't intend to kill Padme. He was angry at Obi-Wan for everything that Obi-Wan was basically trying to detach him from the Emperor after everything the Emperor had achieved for the Republic. And it is that his motivation enough for him to want to lash out at Obi-Wan, and instead he kills Padme in the action. I can't really see another situation other than just Anakin losing his character, because you have to preserve Anakin's character. It is something the film failed miserably at doing when
Yeah.
Anakin was turned, and it has to be a slow escalation, as I've tried to outline. Up until this point, Anakin's character has been incredibly consistent, and so is Padme's. In this moment, Padme is acting entirely within character. She has built herself up not only as, Anakin's wife, but also as a leader of her people. And she is emphasizing the needs of her children and the needs of her people above that of Palpatine, which has been a very consistent motivation. And Anakin, as with the Jedi, has been unable to reconcile those two things either: loyalty to Naboo or loyalty to the Empire. And so having Obi-Wan there and having Obi-Wan attempting to use Padme to manipulate him, I think is enough for him to become enraged, but is not enough to kill Padme in a premeditated fashion. But I've been rambling on for too long, Nathan.
No, I think that those are very perceptive thoughts, and you're you're right that given Anakin's drive primarily is love for Padme, indeed his very um, desire to see the Republic as this protecting force is partly motivated by his desire to protect Padme from death and these visions and so on that he's having. So you can't then have him just kill Padme unless he sees her in some way as utterly betraying that. But even then, it stretches the bounds of plausibility
No, I can see that
because
happening with
yeah,
Ki-Adi-Mundi and
yeah,
the Jedi who have been opposing him. I can understand this with Dooku, the act of betraying him, and I can understand this even with Mace Windu.
hmm
And I can't really even I can't see it with Obi-Wan. To my mind, the only thing that would cause Anakin to lash out so violently against Obi-Wan is this exact situation where Obi-Wan is seen as responsible for the death of Padme. I can't see them fighting otherwise.
the only other way I can see them fighting is if Padme is in this injured state that you know she's been injured in some manner, and Obi-Wan is an obstacle to Anakin, in his view, being able to heal her. He's actively stopping that from taking place.
See, I can't see Obi-Wan being in that situation where he would be preventing that. I mean, Obi-Wan would know that the key to manipulating Anakin would be to rescue Padme.
It depends on the cost of the action, though, because I had visions of Anakin required to commit some kind of genocide to to save Padme, but this is very much the Faustian version of Anakin, where he has to do unspeakable crimes to save the one he loves.
See, Rags plays as saying there's a point where he actively chooses evil. I don't believe that has to be the case. I see this as a fall. I don't believe he has actively said, I'm going to be evil. That's his tragedy. He has taken moves which are consistent with his character up until that point. He has been placed in incredibly difficult positions and he has made choices. In none of those choices does he believe that he is actively doing wrong. Rather, he believes in some convoluted fashion that he is actually staying true to his principles. In
Hmm.
siding with Sidious, he believes he is saving the Republic and he is saving Padme. And in the situation with Obi-Wan, he has not been deliberately evil. He sees Obi-Wan in that situation as having deprived him of happiness. It's not that, again, he's deliberately choosing evil. I wouldn't say that this is even premeditated. I would say this is a crime of passion. He is so he is being finally given over to the dark side. He is allowing anger to basically be his guide in the situation and to augment his power. And he's going to use that to kill Obi-Wan. But at the same time, because he is so angry, because he's emotionally unhinged at the loss of Padme, that in turn actually gives Obi-Wan the ability, the clarity to defeat him in the end and contrive the situation where he
Hmm.
does get burned, whatever planet it does take. So like I said, I can't really contrive an alternative situation in which all the characters remain true to their previous sort of setups.
So I think then we should just on based on what you said, and I think we should carry this forward. Then, in a way, we should see Anakin much more like an Oedipus than we should see him as a moral monster. Because when we look at a character like Oedipus, he's actually a noble, virtuous individual who pursues
Mm,
truth and justice. And it's because he pursues those things to the end that he discovers that he's done these terrible things in ignorance,
mm,
but are so heinous that he banishes himself, even though the townspeople don't force him to do that,
mm.
and he becomes this. He hates himself as a consequence of what's happened. In a way, I think Anakin, he's got noble aspirations. He thinks he's doing the right thing. I almost wonder if, in some kind of ignorance, he brings about the death of Padme.
Yes, exactly. I think that is
Yeah,
his ultimate
that's the
tragedy.
key.
And
And
he's
then
yeah.
and then that rage comes out against Obi-Wan, which you've described. So I could see that path.
And
But I
also,
almost
yeah, yeah.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
And of course, his fall to the dark side in reality means this is his ultimate tragedy, I believe, more so than the death of Padme. We find him in slavery in a horrific situation, but all of his attempts to escape that original slavery have landed him in a final period of servitude, which is that of becoming a minion of the Emperor. He has basically sacrificed everything, all of the other orders, all the other possibilities, and Padme herself. And in return, all he has, this broken shell of a man now encased in a suit of armor, all he has now is basically to act as nothing more than the vehicle of Palpatine's emperorship. And that's it.
Mhm.
He begins as a slave. He tries to break out of servitude and he ends as a slave. And to me, this is essential in order to understand Darth Vader in episode 6. Because Vader in episode 6, had Anakin actually done all the terrible things he did in episode 3, doesn't deserve redemption, really, given how unrepentantly evil he was in that film, and how I can't see Hayden Christensen become Darth Vader in that situation in film 6. Whereas if he is this character that we've
Mm.
outlined, this character who has noble intentions but has inadvertently done evil things and brought about the situation which he was trying to avoid the most, escaping slavery and ending up with Padme, and he's lost both of those things now, then his redemption arc is that much more powerful because we result in a character who ultimately is enslaved to Palpatine. And in a final act of betrayal, Palpatine betrays him at the end of the sixth film. He says, Luke, you can replace Vader. He is no longer of any use to me. You can be my new Sith apprentice. And it's finally at that moment where Vader actually becomes free by killing Palpatine.
Hmm. It's like poetry. It rhymes.
I know, I know.
But
Have
no,
you?
I genuinely think that's a better arc. It makes more sense and it ties in with his motivations from the very beginning.
Hmm.
So it would play out very nicely in that regard.
And
And
and through that, I think Anakin has become one of the most compelling characters in literature, or film, or any sort of media. And unfortunately, all we have in the prequels is Jake Lloyd and Hayden Christensen whining, whereas it is possible to actually construe a
mm,
fantastic character out of all of these events.
what's interesting to me in part is that the Clone Wars series. I don't know if you've seen any of that, but in that portrayal of Anakin, he is it's not perfect, but it's much more like what you're describing actually, because it's an individual who um, is proactive, who wants to use the Republic Army to defeat the Separatists, and is quite strong-willed in that regard, often coming into conflict with Obi-Wan. He is constantly wrestling with the council trying to restrain him or restrict him in as a general, although even though he's winning the battles with by using his intuition and his power and so on. So I do think that version of Anakin is is actually in Star Wars. It's just hidden away in the animated Clone Wars series.
So from I haven't watched the animated Clone Wars series, so I have to kind of like you haven't played KOTOR, but I
Mhm.
think both of these things inform this in some way. But I really think, in terms of my ideas for the prequels, I mean, obviously in the third film, we have a bit of an epilogue
Yeah.
where Obi-Wan goes off and talks to Jimmy Smits. What's the character's name?
Oh,
Um,
or Organa, isn't it?
yes, Organa, Senator
Bail
Organa, and
Organa.
Baylor Organa, and uh, I mean, obviously, Naboo is now in an awkward situation where Luke is technically the king, which is an interesting situation. Um, that's sort of never brought up. Maybe it would have been brought up in a sequel. Had an actual sequel trilogy, had that been allowed to
Hmm.
happen. I mean, in terms of the fate of Naboo, I can just see Palpatine just appointing a governor and
Yeah.
abolishing the monarchy. But also, funny enough, my scenario makes Leia an actual princess again,
Mm.
because she is the daughter of the queen. But of course, for some reason, I don't know how the Organa, the Alderaan sort of political system really works here, or what the Organa relationship is. But we're basically seeing the seeds of the rebellion being born, aren't we? And
Yes.
I think, in terms of an epilogue, this would actually be a good sort of thing to hang the Naboo plot on, because the Naboo plot regarding Padme has been focused on autonomy for these various regions at the fringe, i.e., these separate planets who are simply not going to become dominions of the Empire. And as we see with the creation of the Death Star in episode 4, it is a gradual process. It is not an immediate process where
Mm.
all the planets become occupied and become imperial provinces. The Senate still exists as an organization, and we need a Death Star to force the planets to remain in line. So obviously, Palpatine and Grand Moff Tarkin believe there is such a sufficient threat posed by the individual planets that we need a Death Star in order to intimidate them back into a position of subservience, in order to make the ultimate power in the universe, so to speak.
Mm.
So I think that can be the legacy of Padme, the fact that there is still an independent spirit, technically aligned to the Republic and all of these different planets. And even though the tragedy of Naboo is that she has left it without a power structure in that aftermath, because again, I sort of find it, in terms of trying to reconcile that, yes, that's one way of looking at it. But again, I'm very much sort of making this up as I go along. I'm not sure exactly where this trail of thought is going to lead me. But what do you think is the final motivation for taking away Leia and Luke. I suppose from the Jedi's point of view, it's very consistent that they don't want them to be trained by Darth Vader. They don't want them to
Hmm.
fall to the dark side. They want them to be a potential avenue for the reconciliation of the Jedi. So it's very obvious why they need to be taken away and removed from uh, as far away from Vader as much as possible. But to me, this is something which I've always found very weird about film 3 moving into film 4. If I were Vader, I would then basically be spending my life looking for them.
Yes.
And I don't see any implication through film 3 through to film 4 that there has been any earnest search by Vader to actually look out for his children. And if anything, his whole relationship to Luke should be completely recontextualized, because if he was so in love with Padme, why is he so willing to fight the last thing which sort of connects him? Again, these are just sort of weird sort of things that sort
Hmm.
of contrast as I'm looking further into the trilogies. But I don't want to get too inundated with these thoughts, because I'm thinking of the 20-year gap between 3 and 4. But I think just to leave it off before I overthink this, and this, I mean, this is really a problem, just trying to link up these trilogies and ensure that all
Yes.
of these characters are consistent. And we're just opening up more problems here. But regarding episode 3, I think looking at Padme's legacy as, you can say, the beginning of the creation of the resistance or the rebellion or whatever it is, not the resistance, not use that word. That could be seen as an ultimate legacy. And maybe, I think this is even true in the film, especially in a deleted scene, I think. Do you remember Organa was often, talking to Padme and having those
Yes.
sort of extra scenes? I think if this sort of communion of planets could basically form a resist a rebellion, or rather, you can say, advocating for autonomy within the Empire, then I think that could be Padme's ultimate legacy going forward. Her being the seed of the creation of the rebellion, and of course, Anakin having been responsible for the inauguration of the Empire. And that's really all I can say about this without making this needlessly complicated and convoluted.
I think you've done wonderfully, and I would like to see those 3 films one day. Once it goes out of copyright, it needs to happen. And just on the kind of end point there, I think so. PJ Chen in the chat makes the point that Vader thought that Luke and Leia died when Padme died, and to me, I wouldn't frame it like that for this version, but to me, there would be some sense in which he believes that his children were killed on Naboo, perhaps as a retaliation by Jedi, um, those who support the Jedi, or who are kind of part of the rebellion or whatever. An initial kind of cell, they know that they're his children, and they take revenge.
Maybe to fully commit Vader to the cause of Palpatine,
Hmm.
Emperor Palpatine can say Obi-Wan escaped, and Obi-Wan, combined with a few Jedi loyalists, killed your 2 children before escaping.
Hmm.
Maybe that could be the final lie that Palpatine does to seed that ultimate and definitive split between Obi-Wan and Vader. Maybe the final lie he tells him.
Quite possibly, yeah, yeah. And I almost feel though that like he also needs to believe that they're dead, because you would think that he would want to find them if even if Vader isn't actively hunting himself.
I think he is. And I think this is
Okay.
almost where you can I think that would make sense. And I can't remember because I haven't seen the extra or read the extra material in between these. And I think this is also part, again, because I haven't watched these things, I have no interest in watching the Obi-Wan series. But
Yes.
I think that's a plot point in the Obi-Wan series, that they are looking out for Leia and they are looking out for Luke. and which is
Right.
why it's so important for Leia and Luke to have unassuming, backgrounds. Luke is now a moisture farmer on Tatooine, and Leia is the adopted child of a senator, which is still far too prominent in my mind to really keep her
Yes.
secret, especially given the fact that Palpatine is a Force user and he can recognize other Force users when he's in proximity to them. But these are just more problems, and the more we're going to go down this road, the more fruitless
Hmm.
and mind-boggling is going to come. But I think it makes sense that Vader, almost to put this, if we're going to look at Vader's life as tragedy now, he's gone through his ultimate, the tragedy of Vader being he has sought emancipation, he has sought love with the
Hmm.
death of Shmi, and now he's brought about the death of Padme. He was enslaved to the Hutts, and now he's enslaved to the Sith. Well, you can almost say that he has every motivation to believe what Palpatine says about the death of his children, because that can at least sever any memory he has to that painful past. It is, in every real sense, a act of intentional oblivion to shield himself from that experience. That broken shell of a man basically committing himself, almost again like a man without a will, as would be a Jedi, to enact the will of the Emperor as his only purpose in life now, which, if anything, compounds the tragedy that he would want to forget the memory of his children. So, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a fair approach to it. Um, we've been going for over 3 hours, which is quite amazing. Probably about the length of one of these films,
I think it's
and
longer, actually.
probably longer. Yeah, but I think our version is going to probably be a wee bit longer, given the amount of material we've got there.
I
So,
don't know if you cut out the when it comes to the Clone Wars, if you cut out the what's his name, Dexter Jettster scene, and you
oh, that's essential though.
yeah, and you cut out that scene in the assembly line, and all of these little things. No, I think you
Hmm.
can you can. I think it's possible if you make it very efficient, and the characters are
Mm,
dynamic enough, and the dialogue is concise, then you can
yes.
actually do it. Because the plots, as we're conceiving them, aren't terribly complicated. They all follow a basic structure. All
Hmm.
we've done is taken the plot lines, made them coherent in a way which they weren't
Yeah.
in the original prequels, and we've actually given the characters motivation and depth, which also doesn't exist. And I just want to leave it that way. Um, why did I feel that this was, a fun task to tackle today? I would have no interest in doing a sequel version of this, none whatsoever, because there is no basis of ideas in the sequel trilogy for us to
Mhm.
expound upon. Whereas what should be really clear here with these three films, I mean, as you say, for some reason they have stuck around in
Yeah.
our collective consciousness. I mean, I will happily sort of inundate myself with countless memes of Palpatine doing this and Palpatine doing that because it's such a timeless character. And also, I think, given the very obvious political and historical
Hmm.
themes that are woven in, I mean, they're always a bit on the nose for me, but not necessarily on the nose for a layperson. Nevertheless, it's interesting and engaging enough to keep bringing people back to these films for some inexplicable reason. There is a foundation here for some incredible films. All it required was for George Lucas to redraft and, if possible, actually admit that he was out of his depth in doing this, and maybe get co-writers in and script doctors
Hmm.
in to rework these characters and to flesh all of this out. Because if you focus on these core aspects, these central themes and the characters, I think it was possible to create masterpieces that could have eclipsed the original trilogy. I really do actually believe that. But unfortunately, George Lucas didn't have it in him. And in the end, we got these muddled, bizarre films, which are endlessly fascinating to talk about. The potential, but ultimately the result was, I will say the result was a disaster, unfortunately.
uh, I wouldn't be so harsh, but I do see what you're saying about the potential for genuine brilliance and genius, and something which would have lasted well beyond our generation could have been made out of the materials that were there.
It's
A,
possible
a
that,
modern kind of
yeah.
epic or tragedy of some kind.
I mean,
You know.
it's possible that had this happened, Lucas would never have sold Lucasfilm to Disney, and he would have tried to make his version of the sequel trilogy, which, if this trilogy were actually good, would be quite interested in seeing, to be honest. But alas, we didn't get that, and
Mhm.
there's really no point in talking about Star Wars now beyond these films.
No, what's interesting to me is so something like the game you were mentioning, Knights of the Old Republic, and so on, and then the prequels. The interesting stuff is in the past of Star Wars, not in the future of it. You know, which is counterintuitive, but that's because the originals give us hints of things in the past, which are so much more compelling than, well, whatever comes after the defeat of Sidious in episode 6 is always going to be a bit contrived. So it has a natural coherence with the rest of
Yes,
it.
yes, the 6 films have a consistent story, which the one character holding it all together, of course, there were 2 characters really, but principally Anakin, and of course Sidious being the ultimate antagonist throughout all of these things. But because you have to conceive this, as characters and not just as
Hmm.
grand tales involving the Republic, involving the Force, because they can go on ad nauseum. But there is a clear catharsis at the end of the 6th film,
Yes.
and all the 7th film does intentionally is tell Luke and Leia that everything you did was pointless. And
You.
of Yeah, and of course this is
Mhm.
illustrated with the fact that in film 9, Palpatine comes back, so they couldn't even do that. So yeah.
Well, that's an interesting point. Maybe just a kind of point before maybe we get to a couple of comments. And if anybody has any questions, please put them in now because we probably won't go too much longer. Um, the the thing with the prequels that we were kind of you've just mentioned and what we've been going at this whole time is motivation. Why do people do things? Why do things happen? How do they fit together? Where's the consistency? The prequels were bad for that, but at least they did it in a nonsense kind of fun way at some points. Like even if it was absurd, there's a certain charm I think to it. Whereas when the sequels have the same problem by and large, but there's no imagination or joy in it. It's just stale. So it's the same issue. Um, why does Palpatine come back? Oh, he came back somehow. We don't know. It's never explained.
The
Uh,
prequels are more coherent than that.
yeah, yeah. Which is so it tells you something. I think. We have one question here from Brahms. Did Anakin restore balance to the Force when he killed the Emperor? Telos fulfilled. What's your thought?
I refuse to
Darth
answer
Vader?
that because bringing balance to the Force is incredibly nebulous. It wasn't explained at all, really, in the film. And if you notice, I have consciously avoided all mention of that prophecy, because I honestly don't know what it brings other than, you were the chosen one, you were meant to destroy the Sith, not join them. Um, because I don't think, to my mind, my Anakin and my Obi-Wan don't need to fulfill those sort of messianic roles. I'm looking at Anakin as a human with human motivations. He doesn't need to be a bigger character in my estimation. He's fine as this tragic fallen soldier who becomes a unwitting minion of the Emperor. Um, as far as I'm concerned, the resolution in that he redeems himself by saving his son and killing the Emperor, that's all that's needed. You don't need to make it about this grand overarching story about bringing balance to the Force, because, like I said, given the trajectory of Star Wars, the Darth Sidious will be replaced at some point by another Dark Lord who will come in from the Outer Rim, and things will just continue ad nauseum. And what does restore balance mean? Does it mean just kill all the evil people? in the eighth film, it was when darkness rises, light comes to meet it, which just means there are two forces equal in power at the same time. And this also means that if there's an incredibly powerful dark force user, a ray needs to come out of nowhere and magically assume all of these powers. So I think this is an incredibly nebulous, ill-defined, and poorly developed concept. And the only time I've actually seen it well developed, funny enough, was in KOTOR 2, when the Force is basically ascribed a will, and the will essentially is to perpetuate conflict into eternity between the dark and the light side. And so the main anti-hero of that story, her motivation is to destroy the Force, to overcome it, and to end the constant search for balance. That to me is a far more compelling narrative if you're going to focus on the Force as having an independent mind. But as far as I'm concerned, there isn't enough time in this trilogy to really flesh that concept out. You can hint at it, like Anakin's dreams of the potential future and the tragedy that comes about from his visions of Padme's death and him ultimately bringing it about. But I don't believe there's enough time. And I think the tale of the fall of the Republic and the fall of the Jedi is enough to get across in 3 films, rather than talking about the will of the Force and all of these things. And also, if you take it to its logical conclusion, the thing I hate about the Force as a plot point is that it excuses every possible convenience under the sun for plot contrivance.
Yes, it can be rather frustrating, which it wasn't like that in the original trilogy. I think that's the thing which really annoys me about its use in the prequels. It suddenly becomes this magical item which just solves the issue at hand. Whereas in the originals, it's a very limited factor that it has. And when it's involved, so when Luke destroys the Death Star, it has a meaningful impact to the overall story. I think though, in kind of answer to your question, Brahms, I think as Darth AM said, it's unclear what balance to the Force means. Lucas himself has said it did, and if we went with what was just said about the Force necessarily developing these cycles of conflict, you could see it as a kind of Hegelian metaphysics where you have, some state, a counter state rises, there's a conflict, and then through that comes synthesis. If you see synthesis as kind of balance to the Force, perhaps then Vader just killing Sidious could merit something like that. The end of that conflict, a new stage is brought forward, a new age, but then the cycle continues. Yeah,
Do
go
you
ahead.
want my in terms of slavery, bringing this back? The only way that I can see this midway actually representing something relevant to Anakin's path, full light side usage is basically a negation of life. Full dark side usage is basically slavery to emotion and impulse. Whereas midway is basically rising above both of these factors and using the Force for whatever you essentially need. Essentially, mastery of the Force for its own sake rather than you being mastered by the Force. To my mind, that is the only way really of bringing balance. And again, this concept isn't really fleshed out in either trilogy, but it's the only way I think you can actually contrive of balance if you're going to be talking about emancipation and bringing yourself out of the Force as a way of servitude, either to the light or the dark.
See, what one issue actually is in the original trilogy, there's never a mention of the light side of the Force. There is of the dark side of the Force, and that seems to imply light side. But I think for Lucas's understanding of what that means, in a sense, dark side is like a shallow, hollow version of the fullness of the Force. Whereas when you frame it as this binary of light and dark, it makes it seem like they're two sides of the one reality. So depending on which view you take, balance is going to change, because if it is they're just two sides of the one reality, then what you've just described would be balance. But if the dark side is this kind of emaciated version of engaging with the Force, where you seek to dominate using it and thus close yourself off to its fullness, then that's not balance. That's actually, you need to open yourself up to the fullness of it. So I think
do you want me
those
to blow everyone's minds here?
go for it.
If Ki-Adi-Mundi represents the full service to the light, and Pelagius represented full service to the darkness, then who is rising above the extremes of both the light and the dark in order to bring about peace and stability and prevent constant wars between both sides?
Oh, is it Sheev Palpatine?
It is indeed Sheev Palpatine. So it is Sheev Palpatine who has brought balance to the Force, everyone.
Wow, major revelations taking place in this stream. Wikipedia needs to be updated immediately. I do like it. I like that idea. Thank you, Brahms, for your question. I don't see any further questions. Darth Apostolic Majesty, thank you for joining for such a wonderful stream. I really enjoyed hearing your draft versions of the prequel trilogy. It was a real privilege and great to talk about them. Is there anything that you would like to promote?
Yes, obviously on my channel you can have myriad Star Wars related content in abundance. No, I'm afraid relating to this stream I have absolutely nothing to shill, but thank you very much, Nathan, for obliging me in talking about this. I've had a lot of fun, so thank you for hosting it so much and for allowing for this this wonderful deep dive into the nature of the prequels.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And just so folks know, tomorrow night I will be streaming at 9 o'clock BST in the evening. I'm going to be discussing my summer holiday to the island of Orkney. And if you don't know, it's on the very north of Scotland. It's kind of between Norway and Scotland. And on the island, there are several Neolithic buildings, houses, stone circles, tombs. And so I want to kind of discuss my adventures there, and then also something about the kinds of people who were able to build these things. What sort of mindset did they have? How does it shape our thinking about what it takes to build a civilization? So I'll be talking about that tomorrow night. So please do tune in. In the meantime, thank you all for tuning in. Very much appreciated your company. And wherever you are, whoever you are, God bless you and good night.
Good night.